Enola Holmes' Bedtime Mystery, The Ghost That Whispered Her Name. Chapter 1. A Whisper in the Quiet. The first whisper came just after dusk, when the lamplighters had finished their rounds and the London street had settled into that peculiar half-life between day and night. It was the sort of hour when sensible folk closed their curtains and lit their hearths, when secrets believed themselves safest. It was also, Enola Holmes would later reflect, the precise hour at which trouble most liked to announce itself. The street in question was not one of London's grand avenues, nor was it among the infamous alleys spoken of in lowered voices. It lay somewhere between, respectable enough to avoid scandal, dull enough to avoid notice. Narrow brick houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. The air smelled of damp stone and coal smoke, and the late autumn fog crept low, as though the ground itself were exhaling. At number 14, a modest house with green-painted shutters, a gathering was underway. Inside, Mrs. Agnes Tillingham adjusted the lace cuff at her wrist for the third time in as many minutes. She was a woman accustomed to order, to neat edges and predictable days, and this evening had already tested her nerves. The small parlor was crowded, too crowded for her liking, with neighbors, distant cousins, and one exceedingly loud aunt who smelled of lavender and spoke of death with inappropriate cheer. The gathering, officially, was a farewell supper. Mr. Edwin Tillingham, Agnes's husband, had vanished 2 weeks prior under circumstances that were, at best, unsettling. His hat had been found neatly placed upon a park bench near the Thames. His coat had been discovered days later, folded with care beneath a willow tree. No body had surfaced, but the absence itself pressed heavily upon the household, like an unfinished sentence. London, of course, had opinions. Some whispered that Edwin had drowned himself in despair over mounting debts. Others suggested he had fled the country, abandoning wife and reputation alike. A few, those who favored melodrama, hinted darkly at murder. But with no proof and no corpse, the authorities had shrugged and turned to more pressing matters. Tonight's supper was Agnes's reluctant concession to reality. One must go on, her mother had insisted. One must be seen to go on. It was just as Agnes lifted her glass, prepared to offer a polite, restrained toast to uncertainty, that the whisper drifted through the room. Enola. The sound was so soft it might have been imagined, no louder than the brushing of silk against skin. Conversation faltered. Forks paused midair. Agnes felt a chill ripple across her arms. "Did you hear that?" someone murmured. The whisper came again, clearer this time, threading itself between the guests like an invisible hand. Enola Holmes. A shriek followed. A chair scraped sharply against the floor as Agnes stumbled backward, her glass shattering against the hearth. Panic bloomed with astonishing speed. Guests crowded toward the door, voices rising in alarm. A ghost. It spoke a name. "God preserve us, Edwin, is that you?" Outside, fog pressed against the windows, thick and impenetrable. And several streets away, crouched atop a low slate roof with her skirts tucked safely between her knees, Enola Holmes smiled grimly. She had not intended to involve herself in a ghost story. Enola had arrived in this quiet corner of London by choice, seeking nothing more dramatic than a temporary refuge. The house she occupied, a narrow rental with a crooked staircase and a stubbornly smoking chimney, offered anonymity, which she prized above comfort. London was large, after all, and she had learned that even the most observant eyes could be misled if one walked with confidence and asked no permission. The whisper, however, was not her doing. She paused now, the echo of it still threading through the air, and listened. Her keen ears caught the aftermath, the distant cries, the opening and slamming of doors, the swell of fear that moved like a living thing. Something had been unleashed, and Enola felt its pull immediately, the familiar tightening in her chest, the sharpening of her thoughts. Mystery had a way of finding her, whether invited or not. Sliding down from the roof with practiced ease, Enola landed silently in the narrow alley below. She brushed soot from her gloves and adjusted her cap, tucking it lower over her cropped hair. The night welcomed her like an accomplice. She moved quickly toward number 14, keeping to the shadows, her mind already racing. A ghost that whispered her name. It was absurd, of course. Enola did not believe in ghosts, not in the rattling chain, moaning spirit sense that sent sensible adults scurrying for comfort. Yet she had learned, through bitter experience, that belief itself could be weaponized. Fear made people careless. It made them obedient. It made them blind. And someone, somewhere, had chosen her name with care. By the time Enola reached the house, the gathering had dissolved into chaos. Several guests lingered on the pavement, wrapped in shawls and indignation, speaking all at once. A uniformed constable stood awkwardly near the door, attempting to impose order with limited success. A cruel jest, one woman insisted. Someone playing tricks. No trick, said another, crossing herself. I heard it plain as day. It said her name, Agnes Tillingham sobbed from the doorway. I don't know any Enola Holmes. I swear I don't. Enola watched from across the street, her expression thoughtful. She noted the details others overlooked, the way one man avoided Agnes's gaze, the way another lingered just a fraction too long near the side gate. She breathed in the smell of damp earth and extinguished candles. Ghosts did not leave footprints. People did. As the constable finally ushered the remaining guests inside to collect their belongings, Enola slipped closer, her movements masked by the fog. She crouched near the hearth window, careful not to disturb the broken glass. Her eyes traced the room's interior, the overturned chair, the spill of wine. The mantel clock stopped at precisely 8:17. She frowned. Clocks, like people, rarely stopped without cause. A sound caught her attention, a faint scuffing near the back of the house. Enola straightened, her pulse quickening. She circled quietly, passing through the narrow yard where fallen leaves lay damp and heavy. At the rear door, she paused. A footprint marred the mud near the threshold. Fresh, narrow, purposeful, not the work of a specter. Before she could examine it further, a voice rang out behind her. You there, miss? Enola turned slowly, schooling her features into mild surprise. The constable approached, lantern swinging. He looked no older than 20, his expression earnest but uncertain. "This is private property," he said. "Best be on your way." "Of course," Enola replied calmly. "I was merely concerned. I heard the disturbance." "Did you now?" "Yes. Awful business. Ghosts, they're saying." She tilted her head, feigning a shiver. "Terrible thing, fear." The constable snorted. "No such thing as ghosts. Someone's playing the fool." "Indeed," Enola agreed softly. She took her leave without protest, melting back into the fog as easily as she had emerged. But her mind was alight. Why her name? It was not a common one. It was not the sort spoken casually in parlors or shouted across streets. Whoever had whispered it knew her, or knew of her. And they had chosen a moment of vulnerability, a household already steeped in uncertainty. She returned to her lodging with long strides, locking the door behind her. From a hidden compartment beneath the floorboard, she retrieved her notebook. Its pages were filled with observations, coded notes, and half-sketched plans. She turned to a fresh page. Number 14. Whisper. Name spoken. Clock stopped. Footprint at rear. She hesitated, then added, "Edwin Tillingham, missing, not dead." Outside, the fog thickened, wrapping the street in secrecy. Somewhere, fear was growing roots. Gossip would follow by morning, twisting the whisper into something monstrous. Enola closed the notebook, her resolve settling like steel. Whoever had summoned her name into the dark had done so with intention. And Enola Holmes never ignored an invitation like that. Chapter 2. Rumors Have Teeth. By morning, the whisper had become a chorus. London did not merely repeat a tale, it chewed it, flavored it with fear, and spat it out in 100 new shapes. In the thin winter light, the story of number 14 traveled from doorstep to doorstep, from milkmaids to messengers, from clerks hurrying to offices to seamstresses bent over their work. The words changed with every mouth that spoke them, yet one detail remained constant, clinging stubbornly like burrs to wool. A ghost had whispered a name. Enola Holmes. In the small street where the Tillinghams lived, windows that had once looked out with ordinary disinterest now watched with suspicion. Curtains fluttered more often than the wind could account for. Neighbors lingered longer at their doors, pretending to shake rugs or sweep steps while their eyes flicked toward number 14 with hungry curiosity. And at the heart of it all, Agnes Tillingham moved like a woman caught between disbelief and dread. She had not slept. Her face was pale, her hair hastily pinned, and her hands trembled whenever she reached for anything, teacup, shawl, latch. She would have preferred to shudder herself away and refuse the world, but the world, maddeningly, refused to be refused. It pressed at her door with sympathetic knocks and intrusive questions. Enola Holmes watched it happen from the opposite side of the street, where she had stationed herself near a bookseller's stall that offered the convenient disguise of purpose. She pretended to examine a thin volume of sermons while her gaze darted, cataloguing. The constable from last night returned, more than once. So did 2 other men in uniform, their boots leaving dark crescents in the damp. They spoke to Agnes at the threshold. They spoke to the neighbors. They examined the broken hearth glass with bored expressions, as though the matter were no more than an unruly cat. Their interest, Enola noted, sharpened only when the whisper was mentioned. Not because they feared ghosts, but because they feared spectacle. And spectacle, in the hands of the wrong people, could ignite a street into riot. Near midday, a carriage halted at the corner, a black, tidy conveyance with a driver who sat stiff as a wax figure. From it emerged a man who did not belong to this street, as plainly as a raven among sparrows. His coat was of excellent wool. His boots shone. His hat sat at an angle that suggested he had never once dashed through fog to avoid recognition. He paused, scanning the row of houses, and for the briefest instant his gaze passed over Enola. Enola did not flinch. She turned a page. The man looked away, then strode toward number 14 with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to doors opening for him. Enola's fingers tightened on the sermon book. Money, she thought, and authority. The combination often did more damage than a knife. She waited until the man disappeared inside the Tillingham's house, then slipped away from the bookseller's stall and walked briskly down the side lane, where the fog was thinner and the foot traffic less. In her own lodging, she changed quickly, not into anything grand, but into a more anonymous sort of respectability, a plain dark skirt, a modest blouse, a shawl that concealed her shoulders and softened her outline. She pinned her cap in place, tucking it low, and tucked her notebook into an inner pocket. Then she returned to number 14 by a different route, approaching from the rear where the yard lay and the mud still remembered last night's footprint. The footprint itself had been partly trampled by morning bustle, but enough remained to speak. Enola crouched, her skirts gathered in one hand, and studied the impression. Narrow, yes. And the edge was clean, the heel neat, someone who cared about their step. A boot, not a shoe. Likely a man, though Enola never relied on likely when certainty could be earned. She leaned closer. A faint ridge of pattern showed in the mud, a maker's mark. Not a name, too smeared, but a particular arrangement of nails in the heel that suggested a cobbler who enjoyed ornamentation. Enola rose and glanced at the back door. The latch was newly fixed, the brass shone a little brighter than the rest of the fixtures. A repair. Recent. Or a replacement. She tested the door gently. Locked. No surprise. But the yard offered other routes. A low fence bordered the neighboring property, where a small shed huddled beneath the shadow of a pear tree. From the shed's roof, it would be possible to reach the Tillingham's upper windows, if one were agile. Enola considered it, then decided against clambering in broad daylight. She was quick, but not invisible. And the whole street was watching. Instead, she did what she did best. She became someone else. She walked around to the front, lifted her chin, and knocked at the door as though she had every right to. Agnes opened it only a fraction, her eyes wary and rimmed red. Yes? Enola dipped her head politely. Good day, madam. I beg pardon for troubling you. My name is Miss Ivy Carter. I am, she let a slight tremor enter her voice, the soft quaver of a woman bearing news, a friend of a friend. Mrs. Hargreaves sent me. Agnes blinked. Mrs. Hargreaves. She heard of your disturbance, Enola said, allowing the word to hover. And she feared you might be overwhelmed with well-meaning visitors. She thought you might wish for someone to assist with small tasks, errands, that sort of thing. A pair of hands, quietly employed. It was a carefully chosen offer, practical, unobtrusive, difficult to refuse without appearing ungracious. Agnes hesitated, then opened the door wider. That is very kind. I confess I have not known where to begin. Enola stepped inside, keeping her gaze modestly lowered until she had crossed the threshold. The house smelled faintly of lavender, smoke, and anxiety. A maid hovered near the stairs like a frightened bird. From the parlor came voices, male, authoritative. Enola's ears pricked. Agnes noticed her glance. They have sent someone, she whispered, as though the walls themselves might gossip. A man from the police office, Inspector Lestrade, I believe. And another gentleman, some sort of solicitor. They say Edwin's disappearance has become a matter. A matter, Enola echoed lightly, though her thoughts snapped into sharper alignment. Inspector Lestrade was no stranger to her by reputation. If he had been dispatched, it meant the case had grown inconvenient enough to demand a louder boot. And the ghost? Enola asked softly. Have they spoken of it? Agnes's face tightened. They call it nonsense. Yet they will not stop asking about the name. They ask me who you are, Miss Carter. They ask whether I know an Enola Holmes. Enola's expression remained gentle. Do you? Agnes looked at her, confusion and fear mingling. No. I swear it. I have never heard the name before last night. Which meant, Enola's mind supplied, the person who whispered it did not intend Agnes to recognize it. The name was a signal, not a message for Agnes. Enola moved toward the parlor with quiet purpose. May I bring you tea? She offered, as though her interest lay only in comfort. Or perhaps I could help tidy the... Please, Agnes said quickly. The kitchen is through there. The maid is too shaken to do anything but stare at doors. Enola nodded and slipped toward the kitchen, but she took the long way, past the parlor door, just near enough for the voices to spill out. No proof of foul play, Inspector Lestrade was saying, his tone impatient. A man disappears, it happens. Debt, vice, flight. Any number of explanations. A second voice, smooth, clipped, replied, and yet his coat was folded beneath a willow. Inspector. That implies deliberation. Perhaps even staging. Lestrade snorted. Staging requires a stagehand. Who would trouble? A wife, the smooth voice suggested mildly. Enola's hands went still on the kitchen latch. Inside her chest, something stirred, not outrage exactly, but a cold, familiar recognition of how swiftly blame found women when men vanished. Agnes's voice trembled from somewhere behind her, closer than Enola had expected. I did not harm my husband. The words were barely more than breath, but they carried the weight of desperation. Enola turned. Agnes stood in the hall, having followed without meaning to, her fingers clenched in her shawl. I know, Enola said quietly. And I suspect the truth is far less simple than they wish it to be. Agnes stared at her, startled by the certainty in Miss Carter's tone. You speak as though you have seen it. Enola softened her expression, careful not to frighten. I have seen other households broken by careless assumptions. Agnes swallowed. What should I do? Enola could have lied further, could have continued as Ivy Carter, the helpful stranger. But the whisper, her name whispered into a frightened parlor, had already cracked the facade. Whoever was playing this game had put Enola onto the board. And if Enola was on the board, she preferred to know the other pieces. She leaned closer. Madam Agnes, would you trust me if I told you I can help you? Truly help you? Agnes's eyes widened. Who are you? There it was, the question Enola avoided whenever possible, because names were nets and identity could be an anchor. Yet in this moment, Enola judged a lesser risk, to reveal herself to Agnes, rather than let Agnes be crushed by men who preferred tidy solutions. Enola took a breath. My name is Enola Holmes. Agnes went pale. You. Yes, Enola said quickly. And I do not believe in ghosts. I believe in people who use fear to steer others. Someone spoke my name in your parlor to draw attention, to frighten you, to rattle your neighbors, to hasten the authorities into action. Agnes's lips parted, but no words emerged. She looked as though she might faint. Enola steadied her by the elbow. Come. Sit. Breathe. She guided Agnes to a chair in the small sitting area near the kitchen. Now, listen. Tell me about your husband. Agnes swallowed hard. Edwin was a good man. Most wives said that, even when it was untrue, for the world demanded such performances. Enola did not contradict her, she merely waited, her eyes steady. Agnes continued, the words coming in a rush. He worked in accounts for a shipping concern. He was always precise. Always careful. And then, 2 months ago, he began to misplace things. Papers. Coins. He would stare at the fire and not answer me for minutes at a time. When I asked, he said it was nothing, only fatigue. And debts? Enola asked gently. Agnes flinched. We had obligations. Everyone does. But nothing ruinous, not that I knew. Not that she knew. There was the crack. Men kept their ruin in locked drawers and called it protection. And the night he vanished? Enola pressed. Agnes's fingers twisted together. He kissed my cheek. He said he would return by supper. He took his hat. He did not take his coat, though it was cold. He said he would not be long. And then, her voice broke, he did not come back. Enola's mind flickered through the details, hat on bench, coat folded under willow. A man who left without his coat, then had it later? Unless someone else had it. Unless his coat had never been on his body at all. The parlor door opened. Heavy footsteps moved into the hall. Enola rose at once, rearranging her face into harmless attentiveness just as Inspector Lestrade emerged. He was a broad man with a blunt jaw and the expression of someone whose patience was a constantly dwindling coin. His eyes swept the hall, landed on Enola, then narrowed slightly. You, he said. I saw you about last night. Enola dipped a careful curtsy. Inspector. I have been assisting Mrs. Tillingham. Lestrade's gaze slid to Agnes, who sat rigid as a statue. Mrs. Tillingham, you cannot have strangers. I asked her, Agnes said quickly, the first spark of defiance in her voice. I am tired of strangers asking me questions. Miss Carter has offered help. Lestrade's nostrils flared, but he did not argue. Perhaps he sensed that pressing Agnes further might drive her into hysterics, which would complicate his neat little file. Behind him came the other gentleman, smooth as his voice had been, tall, narrow, with neatly groomed hair and the polished bearing of a man who made his living with paper and persuasion. He wore gloves indoors, which Enola took as a sign not of cold but of squeamishness. He offered a slight bow. Mr. Basil Worsley, Madam. I represent certain interests in relation to your husband's affairs. His affairs? Agnes whispered. What affairs? Worsley's smile did not touch his eyes. It is possible, he said, that Mr. Tillingham's disappearance intersects with financial irregularities. Lestrade huffed. Meaning he may have stolen. Agnes stiffened. Edwin would never. Worsley lifted one shoulder. The world is full of surprises. Enola felt her jaw tighten. This was the shape of their narrative, a missing man, a fearful wife, a whisper of a name, and now the suggestion of theft. They would wedge Agnes into whatever corner suited them. If she protested too much, she would be deemed unstable. If she remained silent, she would be deemed complicit. Enola stepped forward, hands folded demurely. Pardon, sir, if I may. What precisely has changed? You said last night you had no proof of foul play, Inspector. Lestrade looked at her as one might look at an inconvenient fly. Changed? The streets turned into a theater. The neighbors are muttering about spirits and curses. And now we have complaints from above that I ought to do something. And Mr. Worsley's presence suggests there is pressure from elsewhere, Enola murmured. Worsley's gaze sharpened fractionally. Miss Carter, is it? Your manner is unusually inquisitive. Enola smiled sweetly. It is an unfortunate habit. I find it difficult to accept what I am told without understanding it. Lestrade waved a hand. Understanding is not required. Obedience is. Mrs. Tillingham, we will need access to your husband's study. We will take any account books, correspondence, ledgers, anything related to his employment. Agnes rose, her face taut. You will take them? Without even explaining? Lestrade's tone hardened. It is procedure. Enola watched Agnes, saw the war in her eyes, fear versus pride. If Agnes yielded, she surrendered the last scraps of control. If she refused, they would interpret it as guilt. Enola corrected, her eyes bright, we catch whoever is doing the whispering. Outside, the street murmured and shifted as another cluster of neighbors gathered, drawn again to number 14 like moths to flame. Fear made them eager. Gossip made them bold. And somewhere within that fog, Enola felt it, the presence of an adversary who preferred shadows and theatrics, who believed a girl's name could be used like a puppet string. They were wrong. Enola Holmes had never been anyone's puppet. She turned her cap brim slightly lower, as though it might shield her thoughts from the world, and moved toward the kitchen to gather what she would need: twine, candle stubs, matches, a bit of flour for footprints, and anything else that could turn a haunting into a trap. The ghost had spoken twice. It would speak again. And when it did, Enola intended to be waiting, quiet as fog, sharp as winter, and utterly unafraid. Chapter 3: The Anatomy of a Haunting. Night returned to the street like a held breath finally released. By the time the lamplighters made their second round, a hush had fallen that was altogether unnatural. Doors closed earlier than usual. Footsteps hurried. Even the fog seemed cautious, curling low as though reluctant to witness what might unfold. Number 14 waited. Inside, Agnes Tillingham moved through her own house like a guest uncertain of the rules. The parlor had been tidied with excessive care, the shattered glass replaced, the chairs restored to their obedient places. Yet the room no longer felt obedient. It listened. Enola Holmes stood near the window, peering through a narrow gap in the curtain. She had changed again, this time into clothing chosen not for anonymity but for movement, a darker skirt with fewer folds, boots soft-soled and worn, a jacket with pockets deep enough to be useful. Her cap was gone, her hair lay neatly pinned, practical and unremarkable. She had been quiet for some minutes now, and Agnes finally broke the silence. "You are certain it will return?" Agnes asked, her voice scarcely louder than the tick of the mantel clock, now repaired, now watched. Enola did not turn. People who rely on fear do not like to be ignored. And whoever is behind this has already escalated once. That suggests impatience. Agnes folded her hands together. Or confidence. Yes, Enola agreed. That too. On the small dining table lay Enola's preparations, a stub of candle melted into a saucer, a coil of twine, a small hand mirror, a pinch of flour wrapped in cloth, and a notebook open to a page dense with narrow writing. Agnes eyed the items with nervous curiosity. "Is that enough to catch a ghost?" Enola smiled faintly. "If it were a ghost, no. Fortunately for us, it is not." She stepped away from the window and moved toward the fireplace. Kneeling, she ran her fingers lightly along the hearthstone, feeling for vibrations, drafts, irregularities. Her movements were precise, almost reverent, as though the room were a puzzle that deserved courtesy. "Tell me again," Enola said, exactly where the voice seemed to come from. Agnes closed her eyes, summoning the memory despite the way it made her shoulders tense. It was everywhere. But also, she hesitated, near the wall. As though it slid along it. Which wall? The one by the window. Enola nodded. She rose and examined the paneling there, tapping lightly, listening. Most of it answered solidly. One section, however, returned a slightly different sound, thinner, more hollow. Enola's eyes sharpened. "Did you know," she asked mildly, "that some houses like yours were built with false spaces? Narrow channels between walls, meant for pipes, or sometimes for less respectable purposes." Agnes stared. "You mean, someone could hide there?" "Not comfortably," Enola replied. "But someone could use it." She fetched the mirror and angled it carefully near the skirting board, watching how the candle flame bent. A faint pull drew the flame sideways. "A draft," Enola murmured. "Air moving through a concealed opening." Agnes's breath caught. Then the voice. "Could travel," Enola finished. "Carried, distorted, made to seem unplaceable." She straightened, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. The ghost was already losing substance, thinning into mechanics and intent. A knock sounded at the door. Agnes jumped. Enola was already moving, lifting a finger for silence. She crossed the hall in 3 light steps and peered through the peephole. The street beyond lay empty save for a single figure, a boy, perhaps 14, cap in hand, rocking on his heels. Enola opened the door a cautious inch. "Yes?" "Message, miss," the boy said quickly. "From Mrs. Blakely at number 6. She says," he swallowed, "she says it started again. The whispering. Outside her window this time." Enola's pulse quickened. "When?" "Just now." She thanked him and closed the door, turning at once to Agnes. "Good," Enola said, though her eyes were intent rather than pleased. "That tells us 2 things." Agnes swallowed. "Which are?" "First, the ghost can move. Second, it wants witnesses." She reached for the twine and mirror, tucking them into her pockets. "Agnes, I need you to do precisely as I say, no matter how strange it seems." Agnes nodded, fear and trust warring in her expression. "Stay here," Enola instructed. "Light every lamp. Make the house look awake, occupied, unafraid. If the whisper comes, react as you did before. Let yourself be seen. Let them think you are still only frightened." "And you?" Enola smiled, quick and sharp. "I will be where ghosts prefer not to look." She slipped out the back door into the yard, the night air cool and damp against her face. The pear tree loomed overhead, bare branches rattling softly. She crossed to the shed, climbed with practiced ease, and pulled herself onto its roof. From there, she moved silently toward the fence, then over it, dropping into the neighboring yard without a sound. From this vantage, she could see along the rear of the houses, a narrow ribbon of shadow broken by the occasional window or chimney stack. Sound carried strangely here, bending and echoing. She crouched, waiting. Minutes passed. Somewhere, a dog barked. A door slammed. Enola counted her breaths, her senses stretched taut. Then she heard it. Not the whisper itself, not yet, but the preparation. A faint scrape. The careful shift of weight. The soft, deliberate inhalation of someone who intended to speak. Enola moved. She crept along the line of yards, keeping low, her steps timed with the creak of branches and the sigh of wind. The sound drew her toward Mrs. Blakely's house, where a downstairs window glowed faintly. And there, pressed close to the wall, half hidden by a rain barrel, was a man. He was taller than Enola had expected, though he stood hunched, as if trying to fold himself into shadow. A scarf covered the lower half of his face. In his gloved hand, he held a small metal tube, no wider than a finger, its end fitted with a narrow funnel. A speaking trumpet, Enola realized. Modified. Small enough to conceal. Designed to project and shape sound. The whisper came then, breathed carefully into the tube. Enola. The sound slid along the wall, entered the house, and emerged, soft, eerie, amplified by architecture and fear. Mrs. Blakely screamed. The man smiled beneath his scarf. That smile was his undoing. Enola flicked the mirror from her pocket and angled it sharply, catching the lamplight from the street and reflecting it full into the man's eyes. He cursed and recoiled, lifting a hand. Enola was already on him. She struck low, not with force but precision, jabbing her elbow into his ribs where breath lived. He gasped, staggering, and she hooked her foot behind his ankle, sending him sprawling into the mud. The speaking tube clattered away. "Do not shout," Enola said coolly, placing her boot on his wrist as he reached for something inside his coat. "You will wake the entire street, and I assure you they are in no mood for theatrics." He froze, chest heaving. "You," he rasped, "you're the girl." "Yes," Enola said. "And you are about to explain yourself." Footsteps approached, someone running, perhaps drawn by the scream. Enola acted quickly. She yanked the man upright, twisted his arm behind his back, and shoved him toward the shed door. "Inside," she ordered. He resisted weakly, then yielded, fear overtaking bravado. Enola forced him into the shed, slammed the door, and looped the twine around the handle, securing it with a sailor's knot she had learned long ago and never forgotten. Only then did she allow herself a breath. Voices were rising now, Mrs. Blakely's, shrill with terror, others joining. A light flared in an upper window. Enola slipped back over the fence and returned to Agnes's yard just as the front door burst open. Agnes stood there, pale but upright. "I heard a scream." "I have him," Enola said. "Or at least, I have the man who whispers." Agnes stared. "You, what?" "Come," Enola urged. "Before the authorities arrive and attempt to claim the victory." They crossed the yard quickly. Enola unbound the shed door and flung it open. The man inside looked up, eyes wide and calculating. In the lamplight, Agnes saw him clearly for the first time. Her breath caught. "You." The man's jaw tightened. "You know him," Enola said. "Yes," Agnes whispered. "He came to our house. Twice." He spoke to Edwin. The man straightened as much as the cramped space allowed. "I see no reason to deny it now," he said. His voice was smooth, controlled, the voice of someone accustomed to persuasion. "My name is Caleb Morland." Enola tilted her head. "And you smell of peppermint." Morland's lips twitched despite himself. Agnes's hands trembled. "What did you want from my husband?" Morland's gaze slid away. "What I always want." Silence. Enola stepped closer. "You might begin at the beginning." Morland laughed softly. "Very well." Edwin Tillingham discovered discrepancies in the shipping accounts. Not small ones. Patterns. Cargo that existed on paper but never arrived. Payments diverted. Names altered. Agnes swayed. Enola steadied her. "He confronted me," Morland continued. "I told him to forget what he had seen." "And he refused," Enola said. "Yes." Morland's smile thinned. "He was tiresomely moral." Agnes found her voice, sharp with pain. "What did you do to him?" Morland hesitated. "I did not kill him, if that is what you mean." Enola's eyes narrowed. "Then where is he?" Morland exhaled. "I sent him away." "Sent," Enola echoed. "How generous." I arranged passage, Morland said. Paid a man to see him onto a ship. Told him he would be safe if he stayed silent. I believed, his mouth twisted, that fear would be sufficient. And when it was not? Enola pressed. Morland looked at her then, really looked. When rumors of his return began. When questions were asked. I needed a distraction. Something dramatic. The ghost, Agnes whispered. And my name, Enola added. Morland shrugged. You have a reputation. So I am told. Footsteps pounded outside the yard now, heavy and determined. The authorities are coming, Agnes said faintly. Yes, Enola said. And now, Mr. Morland, you will decide whether you prefer to explain all of this to them, or to me. Morland swallowed. You see, Enola continued pleasantly, if you tell them, you may bargain. You may soften your landing. But if you do not, she gestured toward the speaking tube, I will ensure they understand precisely how you used fear to manipulate a grieving street. Morland closed his eyes. Edwin is alive, he said quietly. He is in Marseille. Or was, 3 weeks ago. Agnes sagged with relief, a sob breaking free. And the note? Enola asked. Morland winced. Mine. I planted it when I returned to ensure his wife appeared complicit, should matters turn unpleasant. Charming, Enola said. The shed door flew open again as lantern light flooded in. Inspector Lestrade filled the doorway, flanked by 2 constables. What in blazes, Lestrade began, then stopped short at the sight of Morland, mud-streaked and cornered. You. Morland straightened. Inspector. Lestrade's eyes flicked to Enola, then to Agnes, then back. Care to explain why a suspect in a financial investigation is tied up in a garden shed? Enola smiled faintly. Because, Inspector, ghosts make excellent cover for criminals. But very poor protection against girls who do not believe in them. Lestrade scowled, but there was calculation in it now. You'd best start talking, Mr. Morland. Morland did. He spoke of the accounts, the threats, the ship. He spoke of the whisper and the tube and the deliberate choice of Enola's name. As he did, the street slowly filled, neighbors craning, fear giving way to astonishment. The ghost dissolved in the open air, revealed at last as a man with a motive and a clever trick. When it was done, Lestrade turned to Enola. You interfere, he said gruffly. You complicate matters. Enola met his gaze, unbothered. And yet matters are now considerably clearer. Lestrade grunted. Be that as it may. You have a talent for being where you should not. Yes, Enola agreed. It saves time. Agnes clutched Enola's hands, tears streaming freely now. You brought him back to me, she said. Even if only in hope. Enola squeezed her fingers gently. Hope is a beginning. As Morland was led away and the street began to exhale, Enola stepped back, already fading into the edges of the scene. The ghost had spoken. And been answered. But Enola Holmes knew better than to believe this was the end. Secrets rarely traveled alone. And somewhere across the sea, a man named Edwin Tillingham would soon learn that silence, once broken, could never truly be restored. For now, However, the night loosened its grip. And Enola, ever restless, turned her thoughts toward what came next. Chapter 4: What the Ghost Left Behind. Morning arrived with a strange reluctance, as though daylight itself were uncertain whether it was welcome. The street looked much the same as it always had: brick fronts, narrow steps, a scatter of damp leaves clinging to gutters, but the people moved differently. Neighbors who had spent the night peering through curtains now stood openly at their doors, speaking in low, urgent voices. Children were shooed indoors. A baker's boy lingered far longer than necessary, pretending to adjust his basket while drinking in the aftermath. The ghost was gone. But the fear it had stirred had not yet settled. Enola Holmes watched from the edge of the street, leaning lightly against a lamppost with her hands folded behind her back, as though she were merely another curious onlooker. In truth, she was cataloguing consequences. Inspector Lestrade's men were still there, moving in and out of number 14 with brisk purpose. A constable stood guard at the front door now, his presence both reassurance and warning. Caleb Morland had been taken away before dawn, bundled into a carriage with his head lowered and his scarf removed, leaving behind only muddy footprints and a very large problem. People had seen him. That mattered. Agnes Tillingham had seen him too, and more than that, she had been believed. Enola allowed herself a small, private satisfaction at that. She turned as the front door opened and Agnes emerged, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her face pale but steadier than it had been the day before. When she spotted Enola, her eyes brightened with relief and something like gratitude. "You did not sleep," Agnes said softly as she joined her on the pavement. Enola smiled. "Not much. Nights are inefficient for rest." Agnes huffed a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. "Inspector Lestrade says they will send word, to France, I mean, to confirm Edwin's whereabouts." "Yes," Enola said. "That will take time." Agnes nodded. "But it is something. More than I had yesterday." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as a pair of men carried a box of ledgers out of the house. Enola's eyes followed the box. "Those will not tell the whole story," she said. Agnes glanced at her, startled. "What do you mean?" "Mr. Morland confessed." "He confessed to what he believed he could survive," Enola replied. "Not necessarily to everything he has done." Agnes's brow furrowed. "You think there is more?" Enola did not answer at once. She was thinking of peppermint powder dusted carelessly on a desk. Of a man who spoke of shipping accounts as though they were chess pieces. Of the way Morland had said certain interests without naming them. "Yes," she said finally. "I do." Agnes drew her shawl tighter. "Then what happens now?" "For you," Enola said gently, "life will attempt to resume. It will not succeed at first. People will watch you for a while longer. They will decide whether to pity you or suspect you. Eventually, they will grow bored." "And for you?" Agnes asked. Enola's lips curved faintly. "For me, the questions will grow louder." Agnes studied her, then surprised Enola by reaching out and taking her hands. "You could stay," she said suddenly. "At least until we hear word. I would feel safer." The offer was sincere. That made it dangerous. Enola squeezed her hands back, warm and firm. You are safer than you think. And I am difficult to host. Agnes smiled weakly. So I am learning. They were interrupted by Inspector Lestrade himself, striding toward them with his coat buttoned to his chin and his expression set into what Enola recognized as reluctant acknowledgement. Miss Holmes, he said gruffly. Enola inclined her head. Inspector. Lestrade cleared his throat. I won't pretend I approve of your methods. I would be disappointed if you did, Enola replied. His mustache twitched. However, you were correct about Mr. Moreland. The ledgers corroborate much of what he admitted. And the rest? Enola asked. Lestrade's eyes sharpened. The rest is complicated. Enola waited. He was not acting alone, Lestrade admitted. There are names in those books that do not belong to him. Men of standing. Men who prefer their ghosts invisible, Enola murmured. Lestrade shot her a look. You enjoy provoking me. I enjoy clarity, Enola corrected. He exhaled through his nose. You have given me enough of that to last the week. I would suggest, strongly, that you remove yourself from this matter. Enola's gaze was steady. And if I do not? Lestrade's mouth flattened. Then I will have to pretend not to notice. Which, coming from Inspector Lestrade, was very nearly a concession. Agnes looked between them, bewildered. What does this mean? It means, Enola said, that the danger is not entirely past, but it has changed shape. Lestrade nodded once. See that it does not change shape near me. With that, he turned and strode away, barking orders at a constable who had lingered too long listening. Agnes released a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. He does not like you. No, Enola agreed pleasantly. But he dislikes chaos more. Agnes hesitated, then asked the question she had clearly been carrying since the night before. Why did he use your name? Enola looked down the street, where fog thinned and sunlight struggled through. Because my name suggests interference, she said. And because someone wanted me close. Agnes's eyes widened. You think this was meant for you? I think, Enola said carefully, that Moreland did not invent the ghost alone. I think someone suggested it. Someone who knew that my involvement would unsettle both the neighborhood and the investigation. And why would anyone want that? Enola smiled, though there was no humor in it. Because confusion is a marvelous hiding place. Agnes shivered. Then Edwin may have seen more than Moreland admitted, Enola finished. A carriage rolled past, splashing mud onto the curb. Enola stepped back instinctively, her mind already moving beyond the street, beyond the house, toward the wider pattern beginning to emerge. Agnes noticed the shift. You are leaving, she said. Yes. When will you return? Enola met her gaze. When the questions do. They parted then, Agnes retreating into her house with a final, grateful look, and Enola turning away from number 14 for the first time since the whisper had drawn her there. She did not go far. Instead, she took the long route through the market streets, where noise and color pressed close and anonymity was easier to maintain. She bought a meat pie she did not eat and lingered near a spice stall where peppermint leaves hung in loose bundles, their sharp scent cutting through the air. Peppermint again. She bought a small packet and tucked it into her pocket. By the time she reached her lodging, the day had warmed slightly, and the fog had thinned enough to reveal the street's true narrowness. Enola climbed the stairs 2 at a time and locked the door behind her, then immediately went to the floorboard compartment. Her notebook lay where she had left it. She opened it and added a new page. Moreland equals instrument, not architect. She paused, then wrote. Who benefits from panic? The answer, she suspected, would not be a single name. There was a knock at the door. Enola froze. She had not expected company, and certainly not so soon. Her hand slid automatically to the small weight she kept hidden near the doorframe, a makeshift deterrent, rarely used but always ready. Miss Holmes, came a voice from the other side. It is I. Enola relaxed fractionally and opened the door. The woman who stood there was tall and spare, her dark hair pinned severely, her eyes sharp and observant. She wore plain clothing of good quality and carried herself with the unassuming authority of someone accustomed to being overlooked. Mrs. Tupper, Enola said. You are early. Mrs. Tupper stepped inside without waiting for invitation. You made a noise last night, she said. The kind that travels. Mrs. Tupper was not a landlady in the traditional sense. She owned several properties, knew everyone who passed through them, and asked questions only when she already suspected the answers. Enola trusted her as far as she trusted anyone, which was to say, carefully. I had help, Enola replied. Unwanted. Mrs. Tupper eyed her keenly. So I gathered. There are rumors. Of course there are. They say a ghost spoke your name. Enola smiled thinly. London is very fond of ghosts. Mrs. Tupper sniffed. London is very fond of excuses. She set a small parcel on the table. This was delivered while you were out. Enola's smile faded. Delivered by whom? A boy. Would not give a name. Enola did not touch the parcel at once. She circled it, studying the paper, the twine. Ordinary. Too ordinary. Mrs. Tupper watched her with interest. Should I have refused it? No, Enola said. Curiosity would only have driven them to greater effort. She untied the twine and unfolded the paper. Inside was a single object, a button. It was small, dark, and unremarkable, save for the faint engraving on its underside. A shipping mark. One she recognized from Moreland's ledgers. And tucked beneath it, a note written in a careful, slanted hand. Some ghosts do not whisper. They watch. Mrs. Tupper's eyes narrowed. Do I want to know? No, Enola said quietly. But I am grateful you brought it. Mrs. Tupper nodded once. You will be leaving, then? Yes. When? Soon. Mrs. Tupper moved toward the door, then paused. Miss Holmes. Yes? Be careful which ghosts you answer. Enola inclined her head. I only answer the living ones. After Mrs. Tupper left, Enola sat very still, the button resting in her palm. It was warm from her skin, heavy with implication. Moreland had not sent this. Someone else was still playing. She closed her notebook and slipped the button into her pocket, then began to gather her things with efficient calm. Clothes folded. Tools checked. Routes planned. Outside, the street settled back into its usual rhythms, unaware that the haunting it had so eagerly consumed was only the first ripple of something larger. Enola Holmes paused at the door, one hand on the latch, her thoughts already stretching beyond London, to ports and ledgers and men who believed fear was enough to silence truth. The ghost had whispered her name. Now it had left a calling card. And Enola, who had never been content to let mysteries lie quietly, stepped back into the world with a sharpened resolve. Whatever was watching her would soon learn what Moreland had already discovered. Ghosts were far less dangerous than girls who refused to be afraid. Chapter 5: The Button and the Tide. Enola Holmes did not leave London at once. That was the first assumption her unseen adversary would make, and therefore the first she refused to satisfy. Instead, she remained exactly where she was for the better part of the day, altering nothing about her habits save one detail. She became far more observant. If someone was watching her, she intended to make the experience uncomfortable. Morning gave way to afternoon, and Enola spent it in deliberate normalcy. She walked familiar streets. She stopped at the same tea stall twice. She paused to read notices pasted crookedly to brick walls. To any casual eye, she was merely another young woman passing through the city's endless motion. But her attention never drifted. The button lay warm and solid in her pocket, its presence constant as a heartbeat. She had examined it carefully before leaving her room, counted its holes, traced the shallow shipping mark with her thumbnail, noted the quality of the metal and the precision of its engraving. Not a cheap thing. Not a personal thing either. A uniform button. Not naval. Not military. Commercial. Someone who wanted to be recognized by those who understood trade, and invisible to everyone else. By mid-afternoon, Enola made her way toward the river. The Thames was a different creature by daylight, broad, busy, and unapologetic. Barges moved steadily through its brown waters, heavy with goods and secrets alike. Dockworkers shouted. Ropes creaked. Crates thudded into place. Every sound spoke of exchange, of things moving from one set of hands to another. Enola slowed her pace. If Moreland had arranged Edwin Tillingham's disappearance through shipping routes, then the river was not merely a setting. It was an accomplice. She stopped near a warehouse whose doors stood open, revealing a shadowed interior stacked with crates marked for Marseille, Genoa, Lisbon. The names pricked her thoughts like sparks. Marseille. Moreland had said Edwin was there. Or was, he had added. Enola's mouth tightened. She drifted closer, pretending interest in a posted schedule while her ears worked. Two men stood nearby, their voices low but not cautious enough. Cost us more than it should have, one muttered. That's what happens when people start noticing columns that don't add, the other replied. Moreland was meant to keep them tidy. Well, Moreland's been taken. A pause. Then someone else will tidy them. Enola stepped away before they noticed her lingering, her thoughts sharp and quick. Moreland had been a caretaker, not a master. That much was clear now. She turned down a narrower lane that ran parallel to the river, her boots tapping softly against the stones. Halfway along, she stopped abruptly and turned, pretending to adjust her shawl. Someone was behind her. Not close. Not careless. She caught only a glimpse, a man pausing at a cart, his attention fixed on the wheel until she moved again. Then he moved too, maintaining distance with practiced ease. Enola smiled faintly. Good. Let him think he was the hunter. She changed course without warning, ducking into a crowded alley where fishmongers shouted and refused steamed in the afternoon chill. The follower hesitated, then followed, too late. Enola vanished. She slipped through a narrow passage between two buildings, climbed a short flight of steps, and emerged onto a different street altogether. There, she paused beneath a hanging sign and waited. The man appeared moments later, scanning faces with restrained urgency. He was well dressed but not well enough to stand out, a clerk, perhaps, or an agent who wished to pass as one. His eyes flicked past Enola without recognition. She memorized his face anyway. Then she let him go. The button was not a warning meant to frighten her into retreat. It was an invitation. By dusk, Enola returned to her lodging long enough to collect the few items she had left behind. She did not linger. Mrs. Tupper was not home, which was just as well. Farewells invited questions, and Enola had no intention of providing answers. She left a single coin on the table, payment enough, and slipped back into the street as evening gathered itself. Her destination lay eastward. Not the docks themselves, not yet, but a small coffee house frequented by men who worked the river without belonging to it. Account keepers. Brokers. Runners. The sort who knew which ships sailed light when they should have been heavy. The coffee house was low-ceilinged and dim, the air thick with smoke and murmured conversation. Enola chose a table near the wall and ordered tea she had no intention of drinking. She waited. It did not take long. The man from the street entered just after the lamps were lit, shaking rain from his coat. His eyes found Enola at once this time. He hesitated, then crossed the room and took the seat opposite her without asking. "You are difficult to follow," he said quietly. "You are easy to spot," Enola replied, equally soft. "You pause when you should move and move when you should pause." He huffed. "You wanted to be followed." "Yes." He studied her, then nodded. "Fair enough." They regarded one another across the small table. Up close, Enola saw that his hands were ink-stained, his nails clean but worn. A man who wrote often and worked hard to appear unremarkable. "My employer wished me to observe you," he said at last. "Not interfere." "And now?" "Now I am interfering." Enola smiled. "Then you have already disappointed them." He allowed himself a thin grin. "They will survive." She leaned back slightly. "Tell me about the button." His gaze dropped to her pocket. "You received it, then?" "I did." "That was not meant to threaten you." "I know. It was meant to test you." "Did I pass?" He considered. "You did not flee. You did not bluster. You did not present it to the authorities." "No," Enola agreed. "I prefer my puzzles unsolved a little longer." He nodded, impressed despite himself. Then I suppose I may tell you this, Moreland was never meant to be caught. Then someone miscalculated, Enola said lightly. Yes. They misjudged you. Enola's eyes sharpened. And now? Now, he said, lowering his voice further, there are those who would like to know what you intend to do with what you have learned. And if I said I intended to find Edwin Tillingham? The man's mouth tightened. Then I would advise you not to. I did not ask for advice. No, he agreed. You rarely do. Enola folded her hands. Who is your employer? He shook his head. Not a name you could use. Not yet. Then give me something else. He hesitated, then reached into his coat and produced a folded scrap of paper. He slid it across the table. A ship, he said. Not the one Moreland named. Another. It sailed 3 days after Edwin vanished. Enola unfolded the paper. A ship's name, written quickly. A departure port. A destination. Louvature. Lisbon. She looked up. Why tell me this? Because, he said quietly, some of us are tired of pretending the tide does not carry blood as well as cargo. Enola held his gaze, measuring him as carefully as she measured every risk. Then you should stop pretending, she said. He stood, pushing the chair back with a muted scrape. Be careful, Miss Holmes. Ghosts are louder than they look. But tides, he paused. Tides do not care who stands in their way. After he left, Enola remained seated, the paper warm beneath her fingers. Lisbon. Another port. Another shadowed exchange. The mystery was no longer confined to one street or one frightened household. It stretched outward now, following shipping routes and money trails, following men who believed distance was protection. Enola rose at last, her decision already made. If Edwin Tillingham had been moved once, he could be moved again. And if someone was watching Enola Holmes, waiting to see whether she would retreat, they would soon discover that she had never learned how. Chapter 6: The Letter in the Dark. The night felt heavier than usual, as though the city itself had grown weary of secrets and whispers. Enola Holmes moved through it like a shadow, silent and unseen, her steps purposeful but careful, as though she were navigating the fine line between discovery and danger. Her mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information she'd gathered over the past few days. The button. The meeting in the coffee house. The name Louvature. Lisbon. A port city, far enough to be out of reach but close enough to be a threat. A ship heading there might hold Edwin Tillingham, or it might hold the next clue in a chain of events that had already begun to unravel. Either way, Enola was certain of one thing: the game was far from over. As the lamplighters' torches cast long, flickering shadows along the narrow streets, Enola found herself standing outside a quiet townhouse on the edge of the city. It was a respectable building, the kind that stood firm and unassuming in the midst of chaos. The kind that people trusted without thinking. It was also the kind of place that hid secrets in dark corners. Inside, someone was waiting for her. Enola adjusted her shawl, drew in a breath, and knocked. The door opened before her knuckles could meet the wood, revealing a woman in her late 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of quiet authority. Her dress was simple but tailored perfectly, and she regarded Enola with a look that was neither surprised nor pleased, just calm, expectant. "Miss Holmes," she said, her voice steady but laced with a hint of tension. "You're late." "I had a few things to tend to," Enola replied smoothly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I trust the letter reached you?" The woman nodded once and closed the door behind her. "It did. I wasn't certain you would come. I rarely ignore invitations. Or make them unless you have a purpose," the woman said, her lips curving into something resembling a smile. "Very well. Follow me." Enola followed her through the dimly lit hallway, her eyes flicking over the surroundings with the practiced gaze of someone who noticed more than they should. The house smelled faintly of tobacco and old books, with an undercurrent of something softer, like lavender. The woman led her into a small sitting room where a fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. "Sit," the woman instructed, gesturing toward a chair. "I imagine you didn't come all the way here just to exchange pleasantries." Enola settled herself into the chair, her eyes never leaving the woman. "Indeed. I'm looking for information. You're the one who can help me, aren't you?" The woman's smile faded, and she crossed the room to pour herself a drink. "That depends on what you want to know." Enola didn't hesitate. "Who is behind this?" "The ghost. The men who are playing this game." "Who are they?" The woman took a long sip from her glass before answering. "You're asking the right question. But the answer is not so easily given." "Of course," Enola replied, her tone casual but with a sharp edge beneath it. "Let's make it simpler, then. What is Louverture?" The woman stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "How do you know that name?" Enola's lips quirked up at one corner. "A gentleman who prefers shadows told me. It seems the ship is important." "Important?" The woman's voice was a touch too loud. She caught herself, then lowered it. "Louverture is more than important. It's the key." Enola's interest piqued. "To what?" "To everything," the woman said quietly. "To the man you're looking for, and to the ones who are controlling him. To all the things that really happen beneath the surface of this city." "And who is they?" Enola pressed. "Who pulls the strings?" The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering to the window, then back to Enola. "You're asking about something that most people, even the authorities, prefer to ignore. Something that's been hidden in plain sight for years. The city's underbelly has many layers, and only a few of us know what's in the deepest one. I'm one of those few." Enola leaned forward, her fingers tapping the armrest, her eyes never leaving the woman. "So, you know who's behind all of this?" "I do." "Then tell me." The woman stared at Enola for a long moment, as though she were calculating her next words carefully. Finally, she spoke. "You're looking for Edwin Tillingham. But that's not the whole story. He's not the only one involved. He's the piece that they needed to move, and you're the one who's getting too close to finding out why. Louverture is not just a ship. It's a symbol. And the ones behind it are not what they seem." "Who are they?" Enola asked again, more urgently this time. "They are people of influence," the woman said, her voice dropping. People who deal in trade, in information, in power. They don't just move money. They move people. And the people they move are often lost forever, with no one to ask where they went. No one but me. And what do they want with Tillingham? They wanted him to disappear, she replied, her eyes darkening. But they also wanted him to speak, to deliver something that would change the way this city operates. They've been watching him for months. They were waiting for the moment when he would crack. But he didn't crack. He resisted. So they took him. And now they're hiding him on Le Voiture. The woman nodded. And now they're watching you. Waiting to see how much you know. Enola remained still, her fingers brushing the edges of her shawl. And if I keep looking, then you'll uncover more than you bargained for, the woman said grimly. You'll uncover a network that stretches farther than you can imagine. A network that doesn't just control one man, but controls everyone who touches its threads. And when you're caught in it, there's no way out. Enola's gaze was cold and focused. I don't scare easily. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm warning you. There are people in this city who are far more dangerous than you think. And if you push them too hard, they will destroy everything you care about. Enola rose, her posture resolute. I've already made my choice. The woman's eyes lingered on her, a mix of admiration and something darker in her expression. Then go. But remember this, once you know the truth, there's no going back. You'll have to live with it, and with the consequences of what you uncover. Enola reached into her pocket and pulled out the small piece of paper she had been given earlier. She slid it across the table toward the woman. I intend to. But first, I need to know who they are. And you're the one who's going to help me. The woman looked at the paper but did not touch it. I can't. I can't help you any more than I already have. Enola smiled, her eyes hardening with resolve. I think you can. She turned and walked toward the door. The woman didn't stop her. There was nothing left to say. As Enola stepped into the cold night air, the weight of the letter and the mystery pressed down on her. She had learned more than she had hoped for. But she still didn't have the full picture. Le Voiture. A ship. A symbol. And a man named Edwin Tillingham who had been caught in the gears of something far larger than he'd ever realized. But Enola had never been one to shy away from a challenge. She would follow the thread wherever it led, even if it took her to the ends of the earth. She had already made her decision, and now it was time to see where it would take her. The shadows of the night seemed to grow deeper as Enola walked. The streets of London stretched out before her like a vast, shifting puzzle. With each step, the pieces of the mystery began to fall into place. The question was no longer just about Edwin Tillingham. It was about the city itself. And Enola knew that the answers she sought were hidden within its labyrinth, waiting to be uncovered. And uncover them, she would. Chapter 7, The Ship in the Shadows. The days that followed were less about questions and more about waiting. Enola had learned long ago that impatience was a dangerous companion when it came to unraveling the webs of power and deception. She spent her time in the city's quieter corners, where the noise of the streets was muffled, and the people who walked those streets were less likely to look twice at a young woman who appeared to have no particular purpose. She had little time for social calls and no interest in the trivialities of everyday London life. Instead, she focused on the things that truly mattered: the whisper of wind through the trees, the creak of a floorboard, the glint of light off a well-worn pocket watch. Her nights were spent poring over the information she had gathered, piecing together bits of conversation, scraps of paper, and the traces left behind by those who thought themselves unseen. The letter, the button, the strange meeting with the woman in the townhouse, and the name Louverture all swirled together in her mind like a storm on the horizon. But it wasn't until the third evening that something shifted, a sign that the tide had finally turned. Enola stood at the edge of a dark alley near the docks, watching the sluggish flow of the Thames as the evening mist settled over the water. The fog was thick tonight, swallowing the city's edges in a grey blanket. She had learned to read the movements of the river, to recognize when it was calm and when it was stirred by something far darker beneath the surface. She was waiting for something, no, someone, to make a move. Then she saw him. The man who had followed her earlier in the week, the one who had watched her in the coffee house, appeared from the mist, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to the shadows. He walked toward the water's edge, his coat collar turned up against the cold. Enola did not flinch. She had known this moment would come. She stepped forward, her movements fluid and purposeful, until she stood a mere few feet behind him. "Did you think I wouldn't notice?" she asked, her voice cutting through the stillness of the night. He froze, then slowly turned, his hand instinctively moving toward the inside of his coat. Enola's eyes flicked to the movement but did not waver. "I'm afraid it's become a habit of yours," she continued, her tone light but with a sharp edge. "Following people when you think they aren't paying attention." The man's gaze sharpened, and for a moment, he seemed uncertain. He took a step back, then a breath, as though weighing his options. "Perhaps I misjudged you," he said at last, his voice lower than usual. "You're not as easy to read as I thought." Enola tilted her head slightly. "I would suggest you make that your last mistake." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he spoke again. "You're persistent. I'll give you that. But you're chasing a ghost, Miss Holmes. And ghosts are not always what they seem." "I've never been one to shy away from what others call a wild goose chase," Enola replied, her eyes narrowing. "And if you think I'm going to stop now, you're mistaken." He sighed, as though preparing himself for something he had been dreading. "You're already in over your head." Enola's lips curved in a faint smile. "I'm well aware. But tell me this, Louverture, what does it really mean?" He hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the river, as though searching for something in its murky depths. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely audible above the sound of the distant foghorns. "It's a ship, yes. But it's also something more," he said. "It's a symbol of something, something that can't be undone once it's set in motion." Enola's gaze sharpened. "And what is that something?" His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something like hesitation in his expression. It was fleeting, but it was there. "You don't want to know," he said softly. "Not really." "I think I do," Enola replied, her voice firm. "I think I'm already too far in to turn back." He looked at her with a mixture of frustration and something else, perhaps admiration or regret. "You're right. You've already seen too much." He paused, his fingers twitching as though he wanted to say more, but held himself back. "The truth is, there's no way to stop it now. But you can still choose whether to be a part of it or not." Enola's breath caught. She was no longer just chasing answers, she was in the midst of something far larger than she had imagined. Something that involved not just Edwin Tillingham, but the very fabric of the city she had always believed to be grounded in reason and order. She did not flinch. "I'll make my own choice," she said quietly. "And I'll find out what you're hiding." He regarded her for a moment longer, then nodded, as though he had come to some quiet resolution. "Very well, Miss Holmes," he said, his voice still low but tinged with a reluctant respect. "You'll find what you're looking for, but remember this, you can't unsee it once you've seen it." With that, he turned and walked into the fog, disappearing as quickly as he had arrived. Enola stood alone, the river's fog swallowing her once again. But she no longer felt the uncertainty she had once carried. The man had given her something, an admission, perhaps, that she was on the right path. He was scared, in his own way. That was something she could use. She turned and made her way back toward the heart of London, her thoughts racing. There was a ship. A symbol. A network of power that stretched deeper than she had ever known. And now, at last, she had a way to reach it. The sun had set fully, and the streets were bathed in darkness. But as she walked, her mind was alight with possibilities. She would need to gather more information, to follow the threads that had begun to unravel. And, perhaps most importantly, she would need to go to the docks. There, beneath the quiet bustle of the port, she would find the answers she was seeking. The ship was waiting. And Enola Holmes, the girl who had never been content to follow the rules, would soon find herself standing at the edge of a mystery that could change everything. But first, she would need to follow the fog. Later that night, when the city was still and the streets were empty, Enola arrived at a small warehouse near the edge of the docks. It was dark and quiet, and from the outside, it looked abandoned, just the kind of place where secrets were kept. She knocked once. Then twice. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the dim light. "You're here," the man said. Enola nodded, her eyes scanning the space beyond him. "It's time," she said. "I'm ready." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then come in, Miss Holmes. Let's see what Louverture has to offer." And as the door closed behind her, the final piece of the puzzle began to fall into place. The fog had cleared. And Enola Holmes was ready to face whatever waited on the other side. Chapter 8: The Ship That Vanished. The warehouse was colder than Enola had expected, its air thick with the musty scent of salt, oil, and long-forgotten wood. She could hear the faint echo of footsteps behind her, and the weight of the door closing seemed final, as though it locked away whatever daylight remained outside. The low hum of the Thames at the docks, the soft lapping of water against stone, was barely audible over the oppressive silence that clung to the room. She glanced around, noting the shadows cast by the dim lanterns hanging from the rafters above. It was a large space, filled with crates, barrels, and cargo that could have been anything from textiles to tea. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary dockside warehouse, untouched by time but not by the weight of what it concealed. But Enola's instincts had long since sharpened beyond mere appearances. There was something off about it, an unease that settled in her chest like a slow-burning ember. The man who had let her in stood near the entrance, his face partially obscured by the dim light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his coat was heavy, indicating that he'd been working here for some time. Enola didn't know his name yet, but she recognized the hardened expression and the wary look in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of her, but he was certainly measuring her. "So, this is where it all happens," Enola said, her voice quiet but firm, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. The man did not immediately answer. Instead, he motioned for her to follow him. "We're close. We're always close." Enola stepped forward, her boots making no sound against the floor. She followed him deeper into the warehouse, her eyes scanning the crates stacked in perfect order, the heavy ropes coiled neatly against the walls, and the shadows that clung to the corners like lingering ghosts. "Do you always bring strangers to this place?" Enola asked casually, her voice a little louder than necessary to mask the tension building inside her. "Or am I special?" The man glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You've proven yourself harder to ignore than most." "Most?" Enola echoed, intrigued. "People who stick their noses into things that don't concern them," he replied tersely. "That's how most of us end up here." "But you're different." "Different how?" she asked, keeping her tone light, though she was keenly aware that every word was a calculated move. He stopped abruptly at a door near the far corner of the warehouse and turned to face her. "You're not afraid of what you'll find." "Should I be?" He paused for a long moment before responding. "Yes. But that's not your concern yet." He opened the door, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the bowels of the warehouse. The air down there was cooler, almost damp, and smelled faintly of the river. Enola hesitated only briefly before following him. They descended into the quiet darkness below. The stairs creaked under their weight, the sounds of their footsteps muffled by the thick stone walls. At the bottom of the staircase, they reached a long corridor that stretched far beyond what Enola had expected. The faint glow of lanterns flickered at the end, casting long shadows that danced unnervingly on the walls. The man stopped at a small door halfway down the corridor and knocked twice, sharply. Then he turned to her. "Whatever happens next," he said in a low voice, "you need to understand that you're not in control here." Enola met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I don't expect to be." The door opened before he could say anything else. Enola stepped inside. The room was small but well appointed, with a heavy desk at one end and a map of the Thames pinned to the wall. Charts were scattered across the desk, some with annotations in a hurried hand, others marked with cross-hatched lines indicating routes and schedules. It looked like a command center, except for the presence of a man sitting behind the desk. He was older than Enola had expected, his hair streaked with gray and his face lined with age and experience. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and his suit, though plain, was tailored to perfection. He did not rise as she entered, but instead regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something calculating. "You're Enola Holmes," the man said, his voice calm and controlled. "I've heard a great deal about you." "Perhaps I should have introduced myself," Enola replied, her voice steady. "But I find that actions speak louder than words." He regarded her for a moment before gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit, please." We have much to discuss. Enola took the seat, her hands resting calmly on her lap. The man's gaze flickered to the doorway, where the man who had escorted her stood, his expression unreadable. I'm glad you've come, the man continued, folding his hands in front of him. You have more courage than most. Or perhaps more curiosity. Enola's lips quirked slightly. Curiosity is a dangerous thing. He smiled, but it was a tight, controlled smile. Indeed. But curiosity is also the reason we're all here, isn't it? She leaned forward slightly. I've been following a trail. I'm looking for a man named Edwin Tillingham. The man's eyes shifted ever so slightly, the faintest trace of tension in his posture. I know, he said slowly. I'm aware of Mr. Tillingham. And I know that you're involved, Enola said, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. I know that he's not the only one who's been caught up in whatever it is you're hiding. The man's gaze hardened. You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Holmes. You think you're uncovering the truth, but you're only scratching the surface. Louverture is not just a ship, and Tillingham is not the only one who matters. Enola's heart beat faster, but she kept her expression neutral. Then tell me what Louverture is really about. For a long moment, the man said nothing. His fingers drummed lightly on the desk, his gaze fixed on Enola as though weighing her worth. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Louverture is not just a ship. It is a symbol, a means of control, a way of moving people without ever being noticed. The name itself is a warning. Vultures circle, they wait. They take what's left behind. And what is left behind is power. Enola absorbed his words carefully, the weight of his statement sinking in. Power. It was always about power, wasn't it? And Tillingham, she asked, her voice steady. He saw something he shouldn't have, the man replied. He didn't just discover discrepancies in shipping. He discovered who was making the decisions. Who was truly in control of the shipments, the money, and the people. You, Enola said flatly. The man didn't flinch. Yes. And others like me. We control the flows of trade, of information. We control what moves and what stays. And Louverture is our means of keeping it all under control. And Tillingham? He wanted to expose it all, the man said, his voice cold now. He thought he could challenge the system. But he underestimated the lengths we'll go to in order to protect what we've built. Enola's mind raced. He wanted to expose it all. Edwin Tillingham had tried to make a difference. He had tried to challenge those in power, and they had moved to silence him. But why not just kill him? Enola asked, leaning forward. Why send him away? The man's lips pressed together. Because a martyr is more dangerous than a missing man. If Edwin Tillingham were dead, it would be too obvious. But if he's simply gone, if he disappears into the shadows like so many others, his story fades away. No one questions what they can't see. And who else is involved in this? The man's smile returned, but this time it was cold, calculating. That, Miss Holmes, is something you'll have to discover for yourself. I've told you enough for one evening. Enola didn't move. What happens now? Now, he said, standing, you leave. Just like that? Enola asked, raising an eyebrow. The man's expression hardened. You've learned enough for tonight. If you continue digging, you'll uncover more than you bargained for. But remember this, the deeper you go, the more dangerous it becomes. You may think you can control the game, but the truth is, you're just a piece on the board. Enola stood, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. I'll be the one to decide when the game is over. He didn't argue. Instead, he simply nodded, stepping aside to let her pass. Enola walked out of the small room, her mind racing with new information. She had learned more tonight than she had expected, but there was still so much left unsaid. She couldn't stop now, not when she was so close. And as she stepped back into the damp, fog-laden air of the docks, she realized that the shadows around her were no longer just a backdrop. They were part of the story, part of the game. And she had no intention of letting it end quietly. The ship was waiting. And Enola Holmes was ready to board. Chapter 9: The Long Watch. The night felt heavier than it should have been. The fog, thick and oppressive, curled around Enola as she moved through the darkened streets of London. It seemed to press against her, pushing the world into a muffled silence where only her thoughts and the distant calls of night watchmen cut through the stillness. She had learned more than she had hoped for tonight, but it wasn't enough. There were still too many questions, too many shadows stretching beyond her grasp. The man in the warehouse, with his cryptic words about power and control, had only whetted her appetite. He hadn't given her the full picture. And she knew he wouldn't. He wasn't the one pulling the strings, not entirely. But now, she had a new sense of urgency. She had learned that Edwin Tillingham hadn't just stumbled onto something dangerous. He had seen a system, a network of influence, operating beneath the surface of London's trade, moving people and goods like chess pieces. And Louverture was the ship that had played a key role in that system. But what did it all mean? What was Tillingham really trying to expose? Enola's steps quickened as she approached the docklands, her eyes scanning the dark horizon for any sign of the ship. The docks were quieter at night, the usual bustle of workers and merchants stilled by the lateness of the hour. She had expected this. After all, Louverture was not a ship that moved in the open. It was a shadow itself, slipping through the water under the cover of night, a piece of the city's dark, hidden machinery. She had to see it. She had to know if the ship that had been mentioned so many times was truly the linchpin of this whole conspiracy. It was the only way to understand the bigger picture, and if she was right, Edwin Tillingham would be there, or at least a step closer to the truth. She had already planned her route. The ship wouldn't be docked in the obvious places, where customs officers and porters would see it. No, it would be tucked away in one of the quieter, more private docks, hidden behind warehouses and barricades. Enola had been here enough to know which paths were safe and which led to nothing but trouble. The fog grew thicker as she neared the water, the moon barely visible through the haze. She could hear the faint sound of water lapping against the quay, the occasional creak of a wooden boat tethered to the dock. She moved with purpose, her cloak trailing lightly behind her, her steps swift but silent. It wasn't long before she found the entrance to the hidden dock, a narrow path that twisted between two large warehouses, obscured from the main road. Enola paused for a moment, scanning the area. She was close now, but she could feel the weight of being watched. She wasn't the only one who knew these streets. but it was too late to turn back. She moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, her breath steady despite the mounting tension. The sound of footsteps behind her made her pause, a quick glance over her shoulder revealing nothing more than the blur of mist. It was a trick of the light. She was being paranoid. The docks were quiet. Too quiet, and then, there it was. Louverture, the ship lay in the farthest dock, half hidden by the thick curtain of fog that clung to the water. Its hull was dark, barely distinguishable from the murky surface beneath it. The ship was still, silent, like a predator waiting to strike. There was no sign of activity, no dock hands unloading cargo, no light spilling from the windows. Just the ship, standing alone in the dark, as if daring anyone to approach. Enola's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment she had been preparing for. She crept closer, moving silently across the wet dock, the planks beneath her feet creaking only slightly. She reached the edge of the ship's dock and crouched behind a stack of crates, her eyes fixed on the ship. There was no movement, no indication that anyone was aboard. But something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and instinctively, Enola pressed herself deeper into the shadows. The fog had thickened again, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink, the air growing heavier as the space between her and the ship seemed to stretch. She wasn't alone anymore. Two figures had emerged from the shadows, crossing the dock toward the ship. Enola's eyes narrowed. They were dressed in dark coats, their faces obscured by the fog. One of them carried a bundle, wrapped in heavy cloth, and the other seemed to be scanning the area, keeping a lookout. They were transferring something. Enola's mind raced. This was it. This was what she had been waiting for. Whatever, or whoever, was on that ship was being moved. She had no idea who they were, but she had a feeling that the man carrying the bundle was not a mere dock worker. She remained still, watching, waiting for the right moment. The two men reached the ship's gangplank and boarded without a sound. Enola considered following, but she knew better. She needed information. She couldn't risk being caught, not when she was so close. Her eyes darted to the crate nearest her, her hand instinctively reaching for it. She needed something to hide behind, something to block her view from the men on the ship. She ducked low, moving as quietly as possible, and slipped into the shadows of a nearby pile of crates. Minutes passed, and she waited, her muscles tense with the anticipation of what would happen next. The fog rolled in thicker now, the visibility growing worse by the moment. She had to make her move soon, or risk losing the chance entirely. Finally, the two men returned, their hands empty. They spoke in low voices, their words indistinguishable from the distant sounds of the river. One of them looked back at the ship for a moment, and Enola could feel his gaze linger just a moment too long. Her heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. She had to know what they were doing, who they were. She could not afford to leave without more answers. As they walked past, Enola made her decision. She waited until they had moved further down the dock, then, with a surge of adrenaline, she moved swiftly and silently toward the ship. She reached the gangplank, her heart thudding in her chest as she gripped the wooden edge and pulled herself up. She was careful, her footsteps light as she ascended. The ship was quiet, too quiet. She made her way toward the lower deck, creeping through the darkened corridors, her fingers brushing the walls as she moved. She had no idea what she would find, but she knew this was her chance. She was so close to the answers. The sound of voices reached her ears, two men, arguing softly, though the words were lost in the thick fog around her. She crouched down low, peeking around the corner to find them standing in the center of a narrow corridor. "We can't keep him here," one of the men said. "He's too valuable to be locked away like this." "I don't care how valuable he is," the other replied, his tone harsh. "He stays where he is until we're ready." Enola's breath caught. Valuable? The tone was unmistakable. Whoever they were talking about, they were not speaking about cargo. She edged closer, moving slowly, carefully. The door at the end of the hallway was cracked open, just enough for her to glimpse inside. There, she saw what she had been searching for. Edwin Tillingham. He was shackled to a chair, his face pale and bruised, but his eyes wide and aware. His mouth was sealed with a strip of cloth, but his gaze was focused, desperate. He was alive. Enola's heart raced as she realized the full weight of what she was witnessing. Tillingham had not been abandoned. He had been hidden away, waiting for the right moment. And now, she had to decide. Should she confront the men? Attempt to free him? Or was it too dangerous? Before she could make up her mind, the door creaked. The men were returning. She had no choice. Enola's hand flew to her pocket, where she kept the small vial of powder she had carried with her since her earliest adventures. She pulled it out, her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared to use it. With a quick motion, she tossed the powder into the air, a cloud of sleep-inducing dust billowing around her. The men froze, their voices slurring into silence as they stumbled back, their feet dragging, their eyes heavy. In moments, both were unconscious, collapsing onto the floor in a heap. Enola exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She moved quickly, crossing the room and kneeling beside Edwin. "Hold on," she whispered, cutting the ropes that bound him with a swift flick of her pocket knife. "You're not alone anymore." As the ropes fell away, Edwin's eyes fluttered, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of recognition. "Enola," he rasped, his voice barely audible. She smiled softly. "Yes, Edwin. It's me." And together, they would uncover the truth. Whatever it took. But first, they had to get out of there. And Enola Holmes had never been afraid of the dark. Chapter 10, A Dangerous Escape. The ship creaked beneath them as Enola carefully helped Edwin to his feet. He winced slightly, his movements sluggish, clearly weak from whatever had kept him locked away for so long. His eyes were wide with confusion and fear, but there was recognition in them too, a flicker of gratitude. "We don't have much time," Enola whispered, glancing back toward the unconscious men. She had to move quickly, or they would be discovered. Edwin nodded weakly, his voice rough as he spoke. I never thought I'd get out. They said I was useless, forgotten." His words trailed off, and Enola could hear the pain in them, the raw exhaustion. "They were wrong," Enola replied firmly, her hand steady as she adjusted his weight, guiding him down the narrow, dimly lit hallway. "And now you're free. We'll figure this out." But there was no time to discuss what this was. Not now. They had to leave the ship before the fog and shadows betrayed them. They moved swiftly, keeping to the lower deck of Le Vautour. The sounds of the men's unconscious bodies slumped in the hallway were muffled by the thick fog outside. The ship was dead silent, save for the occasional creaking of its timbers. Enola had learned over the years to appreciate the quiet, but right now, it made her skin crawl. Silence could mean danger, or worse, a trap closing in. She led Edwin to the aft of the ship, where a small, inconspicuous rowboat was tethered. The ropes that held it to the ship's side were worn but still strong enough to keep it steady. Enola paused, her hand on the rope, her senses on alert. "We need to be quiet," she murmured, looking at Edwin. His face was pale, his brow damp with sweat, but his eyes were sharp. "Can you manage?" He gave a small nod, his voice a mere rasp. "I'll manage." With that, Enola untied the boat and slowly, carefully, began to lower it into the water. The waves lapped gently against the ship's hull, but there was no sound of movement from above. No footsteps. No voices. The boat was lowered into the water with barely a sound, and Enola helped Edwin into it, keeping her movements deliberate and measured. She took the oars and began to row silently, keeping her gaze fixed on the dark horizon, watching for any signs of movement from the ship or the docks. They were halfway across the river when she heard it, faint at first, like a whisper on the wind. A footstep. Enola's heart rate quickened. She didn't dare turn around, but her ears were tuned to every sound, every shift in the air. Her grip tightened on the oars, and she rowed harder, faster. She could feel the tension in Edwin's body beside her as he, too, heard the sound. He was still weak, but his instincts hadn't dulled. Another footstep. Then, a shout. "Stop them!" Enola's blood turned to ice. She didn't look back, but she knew they'd been spotted. "Row, Edwin," she said through clenched teeth. "Row now." She dug her oars into the water with a force that sent the boat shooting forward. The sound of boots pounding against wood reached her ears, growing louder, closer. They were coming. The men from the ship. They'd woken up. Enola glanced over her shoulder just in time to see a figure appear at the edge of the ship, silhouetted against the fog. One of the men, the one who had been keeping watch. He raised his arm, shouting for help. "Faster!" Enola hissed, her voice sharp with urgency. She looked at Edwin, who was gripping the sides of the boat with white-knuckled hands. His eyes were wide, his breath coming in shallow gasps, but he was trying to help. "We're not far enough yet," Enola muttered under her breath, rowing as quickly as she dared. The current wasn't strong tonight, but the ship was already starting to drift away from them. They needed distance, and they needed it fast. The men from Louverture would have faster boats, and they'd be able to track them down within minutes. A gunshot rang out, the sharp crack of the bullet's report breaking the stillness of the river. Enola jerked the oars to the side, ducking instinctively, as the sound of the bullet whizzed past her ear. "They're shooting at us!" Edwin gasped, his voice laced with panic. "I know," Enola said, gritting her teeth. "Keep low. And keep rowing." Another shot. This time, Enola didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her attention back to the oars, pulling them with steady precision. She was no stranger to danger, but something about the chase felt different tonight. It wasn't just about getting away. It was about staying ahead, keeping control. The rowboat picked up speed, cutting through the water as Enola focused on the rhythm of her strokes. She was determined not to let the men catch them, not to let Louverture have any more of a hold over Edwin. They were free now. She couldn't let them lose that. Suddenly, she felt the boat shudder beneath her, and Edwin let out a low cry of pain. She whipped her head around to find him clutching his side, his face contorted in agony. "Edwin," she exclaimed, panic rising in her throat. "What happened?" He grimaced, pressing a hand to his side. "A bullet grazed me." Enola's heart skipped a beat. She could see the blood seeping through his fingers. "No time to stop," he whispered, his voice strained. "I'll manage. Just keep going." Enola's mind raced. She had to keep him safe, and they had to keep moving. There was no choice. The gunshots were still ringing out in the distance, closer now, and Enola knew they wouldn't have much time before the men from Louverture gave chase. She turned her attention back to the oars, but the weight of Edwin's injury pressed down on her, a reminder that this wasn't a simple escape anymore. They weren't just running, they were surviving. The distant lights of the city were growing dimmer, and the cold air from the river pressed against her cheeks, chilling her to the bone. The fog thickened as they neared the far side of the riverbank, where the docks were crowded with ships and warehouses. This was where she would make her stand. If she could just get to land. Another shot rang out. This one missed, but just barely. Enola's muscles burned as she rowed harder, but she knew they wouldn't make it far enough without something else. They needed help. They needed cover. She spotted the faint outline of a boat ahead, smaller, hidden in the shadows, tucked near a wooden pier. Her eyes locked onto it. There was a chance, a slim one, but it was better than nothing. "Hold on!" Enola shouted to Edwin, her voice strained as she steered them toward the boat. "What's ahead?" Edwin's voice was low, filled with pain, but still determined. "A place to hide," Enola replied, setting her jaw. "Keep down." She rowed harder, her arms protesting, her body aching from the constant movement. The boat was close now, just a few more yards. But the sound of their pursuers was unmistakable, the shouts growing louder, more frantic. They were getting closer. The boat was just within reach now. With one last powerful stroke, Enola threw her weight into it and propelled them alongside the smaller vessel. She grabbed the edge of it, pulled them in, and helped Edwin scramble aboard. But the second they were aboard, the sound of a boat engine roared to life in the distance. "Go, go, go!" Enola shouted, her voice sharp as she hurried to untie the ropes that held the small boat in place. Edwin, though weak, understood immediately and helped her push the boat off from the dock, his hands shaky but determined. As they pulled away, Enola heard the shout of the men on the larger boat growing fainter. The engine was getting closer, but they had gained some distance. They were free, at least for now. Enola sat back, allowing herself a brief moment to breathe. The boat was small, its engine sputtering softly as they drifted into the shadowed corners of the river, far from the lights of the docks. Edwin leaned against the side, his breathing shallow but steadier now. Enola's eyes remained fixed on the water ahead, the distant glow of the city behind them. "We're not out of danger yet," she murmured, glancing at Edwin, who was still pale but showing signs of recovery. "I know," he whispered back. "But we're alive." Enola nodded, her mind already turning to the next steps. She had come this far, but there was still so much left to uncover. The shadow of Le Vautour loomed over them both, and the men behind it were not easily deterred. But she had one advantage now: they had underestimated her. And Enola Holmes wasn't about to let them win. The river stretched before them, the fog swirling like a blanket. The night was far from over, and Enola was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 11: The Edge of the Game. The small boat cut through the murky waters of the Thames, its engine sputtering weakly in the damp air. Enola sat at the bow, her gaze fixed on the swirling mist ahead. Her mind raced as the fog thickened around them, the skyline of London slowly disappearing behind a curtain of grey. Beside her, Edwin leaned against the side of the boat, his face pale but gradually regaining some color as he took in shallow breaths. Enola had torn part of her own shawl to bind his side, but the injury was still fresh, and the blood had seeped through the cloth, staining his shirt. He winced every time the boat jolted, but he was determined to keep moving. "We can't go too far," Enola said quietly, her voice cutting through the thick silence that had settled between them. "They'll be looking for us. They'll have reinforcements." Edwin nodded, his fingers tightening around the edge of the boat. "I know. But where can we go? The docks are too risky. They'll check every boat." Enola exhaled slowly, her eyes scanning the dim shapes in the distance. The city's edge had receded into the fog, and she knew they were approaching a part of the river that was not often traveled, a hidden stretch where the docks were less guarded and the alleyways ran deeper. She had a plan, but it was one that required speed, and she couldn't afford to hesitate. "There's a warehouse near the old pier," Enola said, her eyes never leaving the fog ahead. "It's abandoned, but there's a back way in. We can lie low for a while there." "Is it safe?" Edwin asked, his voice ragged. "It's as safe as anything in London," Enola replied dryly. "And it's far better than being on the open water when they come for us." Edwin grunted in acknowledgement but said nothing more. Enola knew he was exhausted, physically and mentally. He'd been through far more than anyone should have to endure in a matter of days. But there was something about his determination, the way he hadn't given up, that made her believe they could make it through this. For now, survival was the goal. But what came after, well, that would be another story. The boat slowly drifted closer to the edge of the river, the buildings of London finally coming into view, albeit barely through the mist. She slowed the boat, maneuvering it into a narrow, forgotten slip that led to the pier. The old warehouse loomed ahead, its sagging walls covered in grime and peeling paint. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, and that was exactly why Enola had chosen it. As she guided the boat alongside the creaky wooden dock, she motioned for Edwin to stay low. He nodded, wincing, and climbed out slowly, leaning heavily on her for support. Together, they stepped onto the dock, the wooden planks creaking under their weight as they moved quickly but quietly toward the entrance of the warehouse. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The shadows were deep, and the only light came from the faint sliver of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. It felt like they had stepped into another world, one where time had stopped, and nothing had moved in decades. Enola led Edwin to the far corner, where a stack of crates had been abandoned long ago. She helped him settle down onto the floor, propping him up against the wooden walls. "We'll stay here for a while," Enola said, her voice low. "Until the heat dies down. We're too exposed if we go back into the city. Edwin leaned back against the crates, his eyes closing for a moment as though trying to shut out the exhaustion that seemed to weigh him down. I'm sorry, he said after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think it would get this far. Enola's gaze softened, but she didn't allow herself to dwell on the past. It's not your fault, she replied. You didn't know what you were walking into. Edwin's eyes flicked open, and he looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. But I'm the one who saw it first. I should have known. Should have understood. Stop. Enola cut him off, her voice firm. You did what you could. You tried to stop it. Don't second-guess yourself now. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the distant lapping of the river and the occasional creak of the warehouse's old beams. Enola's mind was already working, calculating, planning the next steps. She had to get Edwin to safety, but that was just the beginning. The men who had been pulling the strings, the ones who had sent Le Voiture and orchestrated everything around Edwin, weren't finished with him yet. They would be looking for him. They would be looking for both of them. She knew it wouldn't be long before the search spread beyond the docks. And the men who ran this network would not give up easily. Do you know who they are? Edwin asked suddenly, his voice low. The people who've been behind all of this? Who's really in control? Enola glanced at him, her expression unreadable. She had been waiting for this question. She had known it would come. Not yet, she said quietly. But I'm getting closer. Edwin shifted slightly, trying to sit up straighter. His body ached, but he didn't complain. Is it them? The people you've been following? The ones who've been playing this game? Enola's lips curled into a small, tight smile. Yes, it's them. But they're not the only players. And they're not the ones pulling all the strings. The silence between them deepened, and for a moment, Enola thought she saw something in Edwin's eyes, a flicker of recognition, like he had just begun to grasp the magnitude of what he had stumbled into. But then it was gone, replaced by something more weary. So, what now? He asked, his voice soft but full of resolve. What do we do next? Enola turned her gaze toward the distant river, the fog still swirling over its surface. Now, we wait, she said, her voice quiet but certain. We wait until they think we're gone, until they think they've won. And then we come back. We find the rest of the pieces, and we take them down. Edwin nodded slowly, his breath shallow. And when we do that, what then? Enola's gaze hardened, her eyes steely with determination. When we do that, we make sure they can't hurt anyone else. The weight of her words hung in the air like a promise that Enola Holmes never broke. The hours passed slowly in the warehouse, the darkness stretching into the small hours of the morning. Edwin slept fitfully, and Enola kept watch, her eyes scanning the shadows. The silence of the warehouse was broken only by the distant sounds of the city. The fog outside had begun to dissipate, but she knew they couldn't stay there much longer. She had to move. Eventually, Edwin stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He groaned softly, but his gaze found Enola, and for the first time in a while, there was something more than fear in his eyes, there was resolve. What's the plan? He asked, his voice still hoarse but stronger now. Enola helped him sit up, her face softening. "We'll make our way out of here soon. I have a few people I can contact." "The right people. They can help us, but we need to move quickly." Edwin nodded, but there was a question in his eyes that Enola hadn't missed. "Do you really think we can stop them?" he asked quietly. Enola's lips pressed together, her gaze turning inward as she considered the weight of his question. It wasn't just about stopping the men who were after Edwin, after all. It was about stopping the entire system that had allowed them to get this far. The network of power that had made people like Edwin pawns in their game. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice steady, though there was a glimmer of uncertainty that even she couldn't completely hide. "But I'll make them try." And that was enough. Enola Holmes would make them try. Because as long as there was a thread to follow, she would pull it, no matter how dangerous it became. The game had only just begun. Chapter 12, The Silent Watcher. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the warehouse's weathered walls, casting long shadows on the dust-covered floor. Enola stood at the entrance, her gaze fixed on the narrow path leading to the riverbank, her thoughts racing. The fog that had once cloaked the docks had finally begun to lift, but there was no mistaking the danger that still lingered in the air. The moment they had left the safety of the shadows, everything would change. Edwin shifted behind her, his movements stiff, but there was a quiet resolve in his posture now, the same quiet strength Enola had seen in him before everything had spiraled out of control. He had been through so much, captured, isolated, and betrayed, but the spark in his eyes hadn't gone out. If anything, it had grown brighter. "Do you think they're still looking for us?" Edwin asked, his voice hoarse but steady as he approached her. "I'm certain of it," Enola replied without hesitation, her voice a low murmur. "They'll scour every inch of the docks. And they won't stop until they're sure you're not a threat anymore." He nodded but didn't speak, understanding her point. They were not just running from the people who had taken him, they were running from an entire system of power that stretched far beyond what either of them had imagined. "Then we need to act fast," he said after a beat, his voice growing more certain. "Before they realize we're not hiding in plain sight anymore." Enola glanced over at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, assessing the strength in his words. She'd seen him at his lowest, broken and bound by the weight of his own choices, but now he was something more. He was a partner in this fight. And for the first time, Enola felt a strange sense of gratitude that he was by her side. "We will," she said, her voice resolute. "But we can't stay here long. We need to move and keep our heads low." Enola made her way toward a stack of crates, where she had left a few provisions. She had anticipated that they might need to make their way farther inland, away from the docks where they would be easy to find. They had to find a safe house, somewhere out of sight, but close enough to the people who could help them. "The plan is still the same," she said, glancing over her shoulder as she packed the supplies into a small bag. "We lay low, contact a few trusted allies, and figure out exactly who we're dealing with. Once we know who's behind all of this, then we can take action." "And what if they find us first?" Edwin asked, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "What if they're already watching?" "They might be," Enola said, her voice firm as she zipped the bag closed. "But they don't know me. And they don't know you. Not yet. Then let's make sure they don't." Enola's lips curled into a tight smile at his words. The fire that had been missing for so long was back in his eyes. The same fire that had led him to discover the corruption, to risk everything to expose it, even when he hadn't known what it would cost. "Ready?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. Edwin took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." The two of them left the warehouse quietly, keeping to the shadows and moving with practiced stealth. Enola had memorized the route ahead of time, a series of alleyways and hidden paths that led out of the industrial district and toward the safer parts of London. But as they neared the edge of the docks, something caught Enola's attention, a subtle sound in the distance. Footsteps. At first, she thought it was just the creak of the city settling into the morning. But then she heard it again, closer this time. Someone was approaching. She grabbed Edwin's arm and pulled him into a narrow alcove between two large shipping crates, just as the sound of boots on cobblestone grew louder. They waited in silence, barely daring to breathe. Enola's senses were heightened, her mind working quickly to assess the situation. They couldn't afford to be caught now, not with everything on the line. From their hidden position, they could see the figure that was moving closer, a man in a long coat, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. He wasn't moving hurriedly, but there was purpose in his steps. He stopped a few paces away from where they were hiding, glancing around the empty street with a sharp, calculating gaze. Enola's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. The man turned, looking in their direction. Enola's pulse raced. "Stay still," she whispered to Edwin, her voice barely audible. "Don't make a sound." They remained frozen, not daring to move as the man lingered in the street. His eyes scanned the area, and for a moment, Enola thought he might spot them. He took a step forward, then stopped, his gaze lingering on the crates just a few feet away. A long, tense moment passed. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, the man turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Enola exhaled, her muscles relaxing slightly. That was too close. Edwin looked at her, his expression tight with worry. "Who was that?" "I don't know," Enola replied, her mind already processing the encounter. But he was looking for something, or someone. And it wasn't a coincidence he was in this area. "You think he's after us?" Edwin asked. Enola's gaze hardened. "It's possible. But I don't think we're his only target. Whoever is behind this knows we're on to them. They won't stop until they've silenced us." Edwin's expression darkened as he nodded. "Then we keep moving." Enola gave him a brief smile, her eyes sharp with resolve. "Exactly. We can't afford to wait any longer." They continued on their way, the fog finally beginning to dissipate as they left the docks behind. Enola kept a sharp eye on their surroundings, watching for any signs of pursuit. But the streets seemed quieter now, the usual hustle and bustle of the city muted by the events of the past few days. She had no way of knowing who had been sent to track them, or how much they knew, but she was certain of one thing: the danger was far from over. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a small, inconspicuous building nestled between two larger ones. The exterior was unremarkable, a faded sign hanging above the door that read, P. Blackwood and Company. Enola didn't hesitate as she approached, giving a quick, silent knock on the door. There was a pause, followed by the sound of locks being undone. The door creaked open to reveal a man in his late 40s, his face weathered and tired. His eyes darted to Enola, then to Edwin, before settling back on her. "Miss Holmes," the man said, his voice slow but welcoming. "You've brought him here." "We've got a lot to discuss," Enola replied, her voice steady. "And not much time." The man nodded and stepped aside, allowing them to enter. "Come in quickly. We've been expecting you." Inside, the space was dimly lit, filled with shelves of old books and crates that had been stacked high. There was a heavy scent of ink and paper in the air, and the room had the feel of an old office, one that hadn't seen much use lately, but had been kept for reasons Enola knew all too well. The man led them to a table in the back corner, where a map of the city had been laid out. Enola's eyes narrowed as she took in the layout. It wasn't just a map of London. It was a map of connections, a network of movements and influences that stretched far beyond what she had initially believed. Lines were drawn in red, and names had been scrawled across the map, some of them crossed out, others highlighted in ink. "The network is larger than we thought," the man said, his voice tinged with frustration. "These men, whoever they are using Louverture as a smokescreen. The real operation is underground, with connections to every corner of the city. They've got their hands in everything." Enola studied the map, her brow furrowing as she traced the lines with her finger. "So, they've been using the shipping routes, the docks, as a way to move people and goods without attracting attention." "Yes," the man said. "And Tillingham, he was close to figuring it out. Too close. He wasn't just uncovering corruption. He was about to expose a much larger network." Enola's mind raced. She had known that Tillingham's discovery had been dangerous, but she hadn't realized the true scale of it. This wasn't just a matter of revealing a few criminals, it was about uncovering an entire system, a shadow economy built on secrecy, manipulation, and power. "The question is," Enola said, her voice hard, "who is behind all of this?" The man hesitated, his eyes darkening. "That's the question we're all asking. But I think I know the answer." Enola's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" The man leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "The one who's been pulling the strings is someone close to you, Miss Holmes. Someone you've been watching without realizing it." Enola's stomach clenched. She knew what he was about to say, but she wasn't prepared for it. "Your brother," he said, his words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Enola froze. "Sherlock Holmes." Sherlock? Her mind reeled. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. But now, as the truth began to unfurl before her, she realized how little she truly knew about the network of power that had been woven into the very fabric of her world. Her brother. She had to confront him. And she had to do it soon. Because Enola Holmes had never been one to back down from a fight. And this fight was just beginning. Chapter 13, The Hollow Truth. Enola Holmes stared at the map in front of her, her mind churning. The inked lines, curved and marked with names and connections, looked almost innocent at first glance. But the more she studied them, the clearer it became that this was not just a puzzle to be solved, it was a labyrinth designed to keep all of them, lost. Her brother's name had been spoken aloud. Sherlock Holmes. A name she had trusted more than any other. A name she had clung to when everything around her seemed uncertain. But now, it hung in the air between them, its weight heavier than the entire city. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't allow herself to show any sign of faltering. She couldn't afford to. The man, her reluctant ally, Blackwood, leaned back in his chair, watching her closely, his face hard to read. The dim light of the room caught the sharpness in his eyes, as though he knew something she didn't, or perhaps had known it all along. "The game has changed," Blackwood said quietly, his voice a low murmur that felt like the first strike of a warning bell. "I've always known that," Enola replied, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. "But this is too far." "Your brother isn't who you think he is," Blackwood said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "He's been part of this network from the beginning. And I'm willing to bet he's orchestrated far more than you realize." Enola stood, her hands pressed flat against the table. Her fingers curled into fists as her mind raced. It wasn't the first time she had questioned Sherlock's methods, but this was different. The man she had admired, the brother she had looked up to, he was the one pulling the strings? She had trusted him to guide her, to help her understand the truth, not to be a part of the lies that had nearly destroyed Edwin and so many others. But was it really so hard to believe? She had spent years defying expectations, breaking from the roles society had laid out for her. Sherlock, too, was always a figure of defiance, of intellectual superiority. He had always been a law unto himself, untouchable in his pursuit of justice, a figure she had been taught to trust, even in the darkest of times. But now the truth was staring her in the face. Sherlock's game wasn't just about solving mysteries. It was about control. "Tell me everything," Enola demanded, her voice hard with determination. She wouldn't leave without the full picture. "Not this time." Blackwood regarded her silently for a moment before he spoke again. "The network runs deeper than you think, Miss Holmes. And it stretches farther than just the shipping routes. It's not only about moving people. It's about manipulating them, making them pawns in a game of influence. Your brother, Sherlock, is one of the key players. But not in the way you think." Enola swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth, the weight of his words sinking in. "What do you mean? What's his role in all of this?" "He's more than a mere investigator. He's been pulling the strings, using his brilliant mind to predict moves before they happen. That's why the Tillingham case was never just about corruption. It was a test for something much larger, something much more dangerous. He's been working with them all along." Enola's mind reeled as Blackwood's words filled the room, echoing in her ears. Working with them? Her brother, Sherlock? Her heart beat faster now, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She needed to think, needed to process, but her thoughts were scattered, too many possibilities, too many questions crashing into each other at once. It was almost impossible to keep up with it all. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice quieter now, strained with the weight of betrayal. "Why didn't you warn me earlier?" Blackwood's face softened slightly, but his eyes remained guarded. "Because I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it. No one ever is, when it comes to people like your brother. The world is full of people who play the game of power, and Sherlock Holmes has been playing it for as long as he's been solving crimes. But it's not about justice, Miss Holmes. It never was. It's about control. Enola looked at him sharply, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. So you're saying he's been manipulating me too? Blackwood didn't flinch. In his own way. He's been guiding you, directing your actions, teaching you, even. But the truth is, you've been part of the game from the very beginning. Enola's mind was a whirl of thoughts, but one thing stood clear: she had to confront Sherlock. She had to see him face to face and get the answers she had been searching for. But what if the truth was worse than she feared? A small part of her wanted to turn away, to let the storm of confusion wash over her, to pretend that Blackwood's words weren't true. She could run from this. She could keep fighting for justice, for the innocent people caught in this web, without confronting the painful reality of her brother's role in it all. But she wasn't that person. She never had been. She would never run from the truth, no matter how much it cost her. "I'll go to him," Enola said, her voice determined once again. "I'll confront him." Blackwood watched her, an unreadable expression on his face. "You don't have to. But I'll tell you this, if you do, be prepared. Sherlock isn't the man you think he is. And he won't give you the answers you're expecting." "I don't need him to," Enola replied, her voice steady and sharp as steel. "I just need the truth." Enola's journey to Baker Street was a blur of thoughts. The fog still clung to the city like a shroud, making it feel as though the entire world had been swallowed by shadows. But nothing could dull the fire that burned in her chest. She had never feared Sherlock, not truly, not even when she was a child, following in his enormous footsteps, trying to carve out her own place in a world that always seemed to ignore her. She had always admired his mind, his genius, even when it felt like he was a world unto himself, distant and detached. He had been the one constant in her life, the one person who had never doubted her. Until now. As she walked up the familiar steps to 221B, her heart beat in her ears. The door loomed ahead of her, a door that had been the threshold to countless mysteries, a door that had always felt like home. Now, it felt like the entrance to a trap. She knocked twice, firmly, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent street. The door creaked open almost immediately, and there, standing in front of her, was Sherlock Holmes. His expression was unreadable, as always, but there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or something deeper. He didn't say a word at first, just stood there, waiting. Enola's breath caught in her throat. She had to do this. She had to confront him, but the words felt heavy in her mouth, as if she had to force them out. "You knew," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "You knew everything." Sherlock's gaze never wavered, his features still as stone. "I knew you would come here eventually." "Why didn't you tell me?" Enola asked, her voice rising slightly. "Why didn't you tell me what you were doing? What this was all about?" Sherlock's eyes flickered with something, but it was gone before Enola could read it. "You didn't need to know. It wasn't your place, Enola." "My place?" Her words came out in a rush. "You've been playing me, just like everyone else." "You." Sherlock stepped closer, his face unreadable but his posture guarded. "You were never just a pawn in this, Enola. You've always been a part of it. You just didn't realize the game was larger than you thought." Her heart stopped. "What game?" she whispered, her voice trembling now. "What are you talking about?" Sherlock's eyes softened slightly, but the edge of control in his voice didn't waver. "The game of power, Enola. The game that everyone plays, whether they know it or not." Enola took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "This isn't you," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "This isn't the man I believed in." Sherlock didn't flinch. "Maybe you never knew me at all, Enola." His words hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment, she felt as though the ground had fallen away beneath her feet. Sherlock Holmes, her brother, the man she had trusted, was a part of this shadow world. He wasn't just the brilliant detective, solving cases. He was a player in the game, and the pieces were moving faster than she could keep up. The room felt smaller now, suffocating, and Enola knew that the truth she had been chasing all along wasn't one she could escape from. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her heart pounding. "Why did you do it? Why involve me?" Sherlock's expression was unreadable. "You were always meant to be part of it, Enola. You just didn't know it yet." And with that, Enola understood there was no way back from this. Not from the man in front of her. Not from the game that had already been set into motion. The only thing left to do now was decide which side of the board she would be on. And that decision, she realized, would change everything. But one thing was certain, she would never play by the rules again. And neither would Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 14, The Choices We Make. The silence that hung between them was thick, almost suffocating, and Enola could feel her pulse thrumming in her ears. Her brother, Sherlock Holmes, the man who had been her guide, her mentor, her protector, was now a stranger to her. She had always believed he stood for something unshakable, something pure in its pursuit of truth. But now, standing in front of him in the dim light of 221B, Baker Street, Enola was confronted with a truth she wasn't ready to face. This man, the one she had looked up to, was not the man she had thought him to be. He had been playing a different game all along, and she had been nothing more than a pawn. A piece in a far larger, far darker game. Sherlock's gaze remained fixed on her, his expression unreadable. His sharp eyes, the ones that used to be filled with intelligence and an almost fatherly affection, now felt distant. "I didn't want you to be a part of this, Enola," Sherlock said, his voice low, almost regretful. "But you were always going to be involved. It was inevitable. I just didn't want you to see the cost until it was too late." Enola swallowed hard, forcing the knot in her throat to loosen. "The cost? You manipulated me, Sherlock. You used me." "I never meant for it to be like that," he replied, his voice cold but tinged with something Enola couldn't quite place, maybe guilt, maybe something darker. "But in this world, people like us don't get to choose how the game is played. We play, or we lose." Enola's chest tightened. She wanted to scream at him, to call him every name in the book, to throw everything he had taught her back in his face. But the truth was that it wasn't so simple. She had known, deep down, that Sherlock had always been a man of secrets, a man who kept his distance from the world. But this was something else entirely. This was control, not justice. "Is that what you've been doing all these years?" she asked, her voice a quiet whisper that felt louder than any shout. "Controlling everything from the shadows? manipulating people like chess pieces? Sherlock did not flinch. Control is the only way to ensure order, Enola. Without it, chaos reigns. And chaos is something no one can afford. Not you, not me, not anyone. Enola's hands clenched into fists at her sides. So this is your plan? To control everything, everyone? And to make me complicit in it? Sherlock's eyes softened, but there was no trace of apology in them. It wasn't meant to be like this. But when you find yourself in a place where power is the only currency that matters, you learn quickly that there is no room for weakness. Not for those who want to survive. A chill ran through Enola, but she didn't look away. You think I'm weak? No, he said quietly, the words almost lost in the air between them. But I think you're better than that. I think you could do more than simply play the game. I wanted to give you the opportunity to choose your place in it. Enola shook her head slowly, the disbelief in her expression turning into something else. A deep, quiet fury. You think you get to decide that for me? What I choose? What I fight for? Sherlock took a step closer, his voice softer now. I never wanted to force your hand. But the moment you became part of this, Enola, the moment you took on the same path, you had already made your choice. The game doesn't allow for hesitation. She stepped back, her feet braced, her breath steady. That's not a choice. That's a trap. And I won't be a part of it. Sherlock regarded her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then you need to understand this. There is no way out once you see the truth. You can try to escape, but the consequences will follow you, no matter where you go. Enola felt a flash of anger rise within her, and she forced it down, focusing instead on the determination that had been with her since the very beginning. Maybe you're right, she said coolly, meeting his gaze. Maybe I am already part of this. But I'm not you, Sherlock. I'm not going to play by your rules. I'm going to make my own. Sherlock said nothing at first, his lips pressing together as though weighing his options. Then he sighed, a sound full of the years of secrets he had kept hidden away. If that's what you truly want, Enola, you'll have to be prepared for what comes next. Enola nodded, her resolve hardening. I'm prepared. Enola didn't stay much longer after that. She couldn't. She had known the conversation was inevitable, but even now, the weight of it pressed on her. What had she expected from Sherlock? That he would suddenly change? That he would apologize for manipulating her? No, the truth was much harder to bear. Her brother had always lived in a world of his own making, where logic and control ruled everything. And he wasn't going to change for anyone, not even for her. As she walked out of Baker Street, the cool London air hit her face like a slap, a sudden rush of clarity flooding her senses. She had come here to confront him, to demand answers, and she had gotten them, answers that had shifted everything she knew about the world. She didn't know where she was going next, but one thing was certain, she was no longer a passive player in this game. She wasn't going to let Sherlock's world swallow her whole. She was going to find her own path. And the first step was finding the people who could help her take down the network, take down the people who had used Edwin, who had used her. She had to stop them. She wouldn't let them continue to control people's lives. She had already seen too much, and now that she knew the truth, there was no turning back. But the more she thought about it, the more Enola realized something else. This wasn't just about the men who had been manipulating everything from the shadows. It was about a system. A system that stretched far beyond just one case, one city, one family. The world was full of these networks, these hidden powers that influenced the lives of so many without anyone ever knowing. Enola knew now that the game wasn't just a game for Sherlock. It was a system, a way of life. And it was one she was going to break. She walked through the streets of London, her mind racing with plans. She would need allies, real allies, not just people who played games in the dark. She would need to find those who had been victims of this network, people who had been silenced, and give them a voice. But first, she needed information. She needed to know the true scope of this web that had been woven around them all. And she knew exactly where to start. Back at the small warehouse in the city's forgotten corners, Enola gathered her things. The night was creeping in, the fog returning with its thick cloak, but she didn't let it slow her down. She had a list, names, places, leads, and she was going to follow every single one of them until she reached the heart of the conspiracy. But as she opened the door to leave, a voice stopped her. "Miss Holmes." She turned, her hand still on the doorframe, and saw Blackwood standing in the doorway. His expression was grim, his posture rigid. "What is it?" Enola asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension in her chest. "You can't do this alone," he said quietly, his eyes locking with hers. "I've seen what happens to those who try. The game's bigger than you think, and you'll need more than just resolve to take them down." Enola's lips tightened. "I've never been afraid of a challenge." "Then let me help," Blackwood said, his voice low. "I've been part of this for a long time. I know the people you're up against. And I can help you take them down." Enola stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his offer heavy in the air between them. She had never trusted him fully, not like she had trusted Sherlock. But maybe it was time to stop trusting people based on what she wanted to believe. She stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Then let's get to work." As they left the warehouse together, Enola couldn't shake the feeling that the world had shifted irreversibly. She was no longer just a girl trying to prove herself in a world of men. She was a force of her own, carving a path through the darkness. And she would not stop until she had taken back the control that had been stolen from so many. The game was far from over, but this time, it was her turn to make the rules. Chapter 15, The Final Move. The air in London had grown colder as the days passed, but for Enola Holmes, the chill was nothing compared to the fire that burned in her chest. The game had come full circle now. No longer just a passive observer, she had stepped into the role of the player. But the stakes had never been higher, and the board had never been so treacherous. They had spent days, no, weeks, gathering information, moving in the shadows, trusting only those whose loyalty was as fragile as the alliances that bound them. Every lead had been a door to something darker, deeper, more complicated than the last. The men behind the network, the ones who controlled everything from the shadows, were masters of manipulation, and their reach was vast. But Enola had learned that the truth, real truth, was often buried so deep, it took everything to unearth it. And now, she was so close. Her footsteps echoed in the narrow alleyways as she walked, the fog creeping along the cobblestone streets, swallowing the city whole. Beside her, Blackwood remained silent, his face as unreadable as ever. But there was a subtle tension between them, a shared understanding that whatever came next would change everything. "We're almost there," Enola said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "One more step, and we'll have it all. We'll have them." Blackwood nodded, his hand resting lightly on the coat pocket where he kept the documents they'd recovered, the final piece of the puzzle that would bring the entire operation to its knees. "This is it, Miss Holmes. After this, nothing will be the same." "Good," Enola replied. "Because I'm not interested in same. I'm interested in change." The two of them had spent too long tracking every movement, each new piece of the puzzle pushing them further into the heart of the network. It was a tangled web, but Enola was no stranger to unraveling it. The closer they got, the more dangerous it became. They had already lost one ally, but that was nothing compared to the danger that awaited them now. As they neared their destination, the private residence of one of the most influential figures in the network, Enola could feel the weight of the final confrontation pressing down on her. She had known it would come to this. She had prepared herself for every eventuality. But there was no denying it, this was the moment that would decide everything. She stopped in front of a tall, iron-wrought gate, her heart beating faster. Beyond it, the mansion loomed, grand, imposing, and yet strangely cold in its beauty. The home of the man who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The man who had thought himself untouchable. The man who had underestimated her. "Ready?" she asked Blackwood. He met her gaze, his face still unreadable. "I've been ready for years." With a determined breath, Enola pushed open the gate. They stepped onto the grounds, moving swiftly but carefully, their footsteps muffled by the thick fog that enveloped them. Every sound felt amplified, every movement felt like it would give them away. But Enola wasn't afraid. She couldn't afford to be. They reached the side entrance, the door already slightly ajar. It had been carefully planned, every step accounted for. Blackwood stepped aside, allowing her to take the lead. She pushed the door open, her movements silent and calculated. Inside, the mansion was a stark contrast to the quiet darkness outside. Expensive furniture, polished wood floors, and grand portraits lined the walls. But it was the quiet that stood out most of all. The place felt empty, as if it were a shell, and the man who had lived in it had never truly been present. Enola's heart raced as she led the way through the labyrinth of corridors, her mind sharp, her senses heightened. Every step brought her closer to the truth she had been hunting for, closer to the one person who could bring it all crashing down. They reached the study, the door standing slightly open, as if waiting for them. She could hear the murmur of voices inside, low and indistinct. Blackwood's hand rested on her shoulder, a silent warning. Enola nodded. She knew what had to be done. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room fell silent the moment they entered. Across the grand desk, a man stood. Tall, thin, with sharp features that looked almost too perfect to be human. He had the air of a man who had spent his life moving through shadows, never fully seen, never fully understood. But Enola saw him now. She saw him clearly. "Mr. Blackwood," the man said smoothly, his eyes flicking toward her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "I wondered when you would show up." "Mr. Carrington," Enola said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. It's over. Your game ends here. The man, Carrington, smiled faintly, his fingers steepled in front of his face. Is it? You think this is over, Miss Holmes? Do you really believe that? This is bigger than you, bigger than any one person. I control this city. I control the flow of information, the flow of power. You've just been a small part of my plan. Enola stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. Your plan is nothing but manipulation and lies. You used people, used their trust, their loyalty, to create a system of control. But it's all crumbling now. Carrington's smile faded slightly, his eyes narrowing. You misunderstand. It was never about control. It was about preservation. The city, the world, it doesn't run on morals or ideals. It runs on power. And I am the one who keeps it in check. You think you've won, but there will always be someone else ready to step into the void. Not this time, Enola said, her voice full of conviction. Your network is already falling apart. The people you've manipulated, the ones you've silenced, they're ready to fight back. And I won't stop until I've seen every last part of it crumble. Carrington's face darkened, and for a brief moment, Enola saw something in his eyes, fear. It was fleeting, but it was there. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't the one in control anymore. She was. In a flash, Enola reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle of papers, documents, photographs, and evidence she had gathered over the course of their investigation. She threw them onto the desk in front of him. These are just the beginning, Enola said, her voice ringing with finality. And when the world sees what you've done, they'll tear everything you've built to the ground. Carrington's expression shifted, but he said nothing. For a long moment, the room was thick with the weight of what was unsaid, the consequences of everything they had done. And then, with a soft chuckle, Carrington rose from behind his desk. You think you've won, Miss Holmes? You think this is over? No, Enola said, her eyes hard as steel. But I've started something. And when people see the truth, nothing you do will be enough to stop it. With that, she turned on her heel, her mind already moving to the next step. She had done it. She had brought Carrington's game into the light. She had shattered the illusion of power that had held the city in its grip. But this wasn't just about him. This was about the people who had been trapped in a web of lies and corruption. This was about the system that had kept them all in the dark for far too long. Enola stood outside Carrington's mansion, the cool air biting against her skin. Blackwood stood beside her, his face unreadable, but his eyes seemed to flicker with something, respect, perhaps, or maybe admiration. It's done, Enola said quietly, her voice full of both relief and resolve. But the real work starts now. Blackwood nodded. You're right. The truth is out. Now, it's time to rebuild. Enola glanced at him, her eyes sharp. And that's where you come in, Mr. Blackwood. He didn't flinch, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Yes, Miss Holmes. The real work begins now. Enola took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the horizon. The fog was starting to lift, the city finally visible beneath the morning light. The first rays of dawn were breaking through, and for the first time in a long while, Enola felt the weight of the past few weeks lift from her shoulders. She had won. But there was still so much to do. So many people to help. So many wrongs to right. Enola Holmes had set the pieces in motion. And the world, her world, was never going to be the same again. What will Enola do next? The game may have shifted, but there are always more mysteries to solve, more secrets to uncover, and more enemies to face. Will you join her in the next chapter of her story? The journey is far from over. The world is waiting for you to take the next step.